Hello friends, welcome to Universe of Naruto X. If you love Naruto what if stories and anime explanations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's story. Deciding to get a bowl or two, one pulled the curtain at the entrance aside and walked in. Looking up, Chuki, the chef, smiled. "Ah, Naruto, welcome. Should I get you the usual?" he asked, and I smiled weakly, nodding and sitting down at the counter. "So Naruto, you don't look like your normal, cheerful self. Is something on your mind?" he asked, and I sighed. "I just got back from a mission, so I'm just beat. That's all," I said, and he nodded in understanding before placing a bowl of ramen in front of me. "Well, here you are. One Ichiraku miso ramen with extra pork, just the way you like it," he said, and I smiled, thanking him and grabbing some chopsticks before beginning to eat. "So, word on the street is that it's your birthday today. How old does that make you today?" he asked, and I sighed. 19, but I don't really celebrate it," I said, and he looked at me in surprise. "What? Why wouldn't you celebrate your birthday?" he asked, but I shook my head, picking up my bowl and sipping the broth before setting the empty bowl back down. "I have my reasons," I said, looking away. "And anyways, I would just be celebrating alone," I said, before standing up and taking out my wallet. "You know, I'm no longer that hungry. I think I'm going to go now. Thanks for the food, old man Chuki," I said, placing some money on the counter before walking out of the shop. Walking through the shopping district, I stopped by the general store and picked up several bags of candles and made my way to the cemetery, preparing for what I did every year on my birthday. As the wooden walls surrounding the cemetery came into view, I took a deep breath. Entering the wooden gate, I immediately felt the wary gazes of the people visiting the dead loved ones. Nodding respectably to them, I slowly began to set candles down at each tombstone, lighting them and saying a quick prayer. After setting down the candles, I began to head towards the statue of the flame in the center before someone called my name. "Naruto," they said, and I turned around only to see Iruka-sensei. Oh. Hey Iruka-sensei. What's up?" I asked, continuing towards the statue. Placing a hand on my shoulder, he smiled. What are you doing here, Naruto? Shouldn't you be out with your friends celebrating your birthday?" he asked, and I sighed. "Why should I?" I asked, and he lifted his hand from my shoulder slightly, looking at me in surprise. "This isn't a day anyone should celebrate. It may be my birthday, but today also marks the event that took so many lives 19 years ago. Just look around. I may be a shinobi of the leaf, but nobody can forget what's been locked up inside of me," I said, turning away. "Naruto," he began, before taking a look around, noticing the looks of weariness that were being pointed my way. Sighing, I shook my head. "Anyways, to answer your question, don't mind me. I'm just here to pay my respects, like I do every year," I said, walking to the base of the statue. Iruka-sensei frowned, but understanding that I needed space, he went to the other side of the statue, presumably to pray to his parents. Sitting down, I placed down and lit a candle before lowering my head and closing my eyes to pray as well. "Naruto." Scrunching my eyes, I tried to ignore the voice that I knew belonged to the Nine Tails. "Naruto, open your eyes." The voice went on, and I sighed, opening my eyes only to find myself inside my mindscape, which now consisted of a lush forest, Nine Tails lying on a flat stone in the center, looking at me through one half-open eye. The cage that Nine Tails had previously been in was now gone. Looking around, I couldn't help but remember back to when I changed it from what it had previously been. Flashback. Opening my eyes, I found myself in the darkness of the tunnels that were in my mindscape. Actually meaning to be here for once, I smiled, making my way towards where I knew the Nine Tails was. After walking for a few minutes, I finally made it to a large open room, the cage holding the giant fox now in front of me. Sensing my chakra, the fox opened one large red eye. "Ah, if it isn't the brat. What are you doing here, kid? Don't tell me you're here to try and take more chakra from me," Nine Tails said, and I grinned. "Ha, you can't call me a kid anymore. I just turned 18. I'm officially an adult," I said, and he just snorted, closing his eyes once again. "Please, With how long I've been alive, you're all kids compared to me. Anyways, what are you doing here? You are obviously not here for chakra, or you would have already tried something. He said, and I frowned slightly, grumbling at being dismissed like that. A few seconds later, I grinned again. The pervy sage taught me a new jutsu since I just turned 18. I said, and Nine Tails once again opened an eye. Think of a place that would make you happy. I said, excited at the concept of trying out this new jutsu. Nine Tails slowly sat up, opening his other eye before a dark look crossed his face. A place that would make me happy. That's easy, the hidden leaf, crushed beneath me. He growled, a violent glow in his eyes. Gulping, I sweat dropped before beginning to form the hand signs needed for this jutsu. You really are a violent guy, you know? I asked, and he snorted, glaring at me. Anyways, lush forest it is. I said, pressing my hands against the bars. With a sudden flash of bright light, the bars of the cage began to sink into the ground, and along with them the cage began to disappear. In their place, trees started growing out of the floor, which was now covered with dirt and grass. Nine Tails looked around in confusion, slowly raising higher as a flat stone rose out of the ground. After a few seconds, he began to laugh darkly. Fool, you just got rid of the only thing keeping me from killing you right here. He said, rising to his full height. I stood my ground and smiled up at him. He looked down at me in confusion. You really are a fool, aren't you? I just threatened to kill you, yet you stand there and smile at me like that. He said, and I shook my head. You won't kill me, or what I should say is that you can't. You die as well, since you're sealed inside of me. I said, and he looked at me in rage. That's right, the pervy sage told me all about that. I said, you brat. I may not be able to kill you, but I can still take over your body and destroy the hidden leaf that way. The seal is gone, Nine Tails yelled, and I shook my head. No, you can't. Look around at the trees. I said, and he looked around, his eyes filling with more rage when he saw the kanji for seal etched into the trunks of the trees. With a sigh, he sank back down, lying himself down on the stone. Clever. So, what even was the purpose of all this? He asked, and I leaned against one of the trees. Honestly, you spent 18 years locked away behind bars. I thought you'd like a little bit of freedom I was able to give you. Plus, I thought that it might take care of a bit of that hate that you have. I said, and he snorted. If you actually thought that this would change anything, then you are naive and still truly a kid. He said before continuing on. Though I do suppose you have earned the right to know my true title. I am not named Fox, nor is my name Nine Tails. I am Kurama, Queen of the Bijuas. Nine Tails said with pride. I chuckled, rolling my eyes. Oh. Please, with the way you are always calling me brat and kid, why would I ever? I started before what she had said hit me. Wait, Queen, why you're female? But you don't sound or look female. She asked, and I gulped, nodding. This is your mindscape. I sound and appear however you imagine me to. She said, and I raised an eyebrow. You mean that if I think of you as feminine, you'll look and sound that way? I asked, and she nodded, though she looked at me warily. Closing my eyes, I began to imagine her voice sounding softer and smoother, the complete opposite of what it was currently. Next, I pictured her quite a bit smaller than she originally was, as well as imagine her as close to a vixen as I could. Keeping my eyes scrunched shut for a bit longer, I heard a gasp from in front of me. Wow, you've always said how the old man was a pervert, but I never would have thought you were just as perverted. A voice said, and I raised an eyebrow in confusion before opening my eyes. As soon as I did, I nearly fell over, as in front of me, there no longer was a giant fox in front of me, but something that caused my jaw to drop. What the hell, you stupid fox. I didn't picture you like that. I screamed, taking a few steps back. She almost looked human standing in front of me on two legs. However, a few of her features seemed to carry over from her fox form, like her muzzle, ears, and tails. She also kept her fur, which covered her completely from head to toe. What's the matter, Naruto? Don't you like this form? She asked with a look of mock sadness, following me and pressing her chest against mine, a black bra and panties the only thing covering her. Jumping back, I glared at her. Oh, of course not. I said, looking away, and she snickered. Yeah, well, some part of you obviously does, she said, pointing at my crotch and laughing, and I glared at her. Did you honestly think that you could change me in any way? I may be trapped inside your mind, but that doesn't mean I'm a part of it, she said, and I sighed, turning around and beginning to walk away. Last time I ever tried to help you in any way, I mumbled, getting ready to enter the tunnel again. Taking one last look back at her, I saw what I could only describe as a bit of fondness in her eyes before shaking my head. There was no way the Nine Tails could ever feel fondness for anything. End of flashback. Looking at the fox, I couldn't help but sigh. What do you want? And what's with that voice? You've already proven that you're female, I said, and she slowly sat up. Why are you in that dump? She asked, and I looked at her in a mixture of confusion and anger. What are you talking about? If you mean the cemetery, then you're wrong. It's not a dump, it's a place we lay our friends and families to rest, I said, and she snorted. You dump their bodies in the ground and leave them to rot. That is the definition of a dump. And again I ask, why are you here? None of these people were your friends, and you've lived alone all these years, she said, and whether or not she meant her not, she struck a nerve. Frowning slightly, I sighed. Hey, Kurama, I asked, and she looked at me in surprise. I know 19 years ago you were being controlled by that masked man, but did you actually mean to attack the hidden leaf? I asked, and the look of surprise in her eyes turned to stubborn pride. Of course I did. I am the Nine Tails. Nothing I've done was an accident, she yelled, and I sighed. Good to know, I guess, I said, and she looked at me in confusion when I showed no anger. If that's all you wanted me here for, I guess I'll be going. I do have missions that I go on, and I need my rest, I said, turning around and beginning to walk away, when a large fist landed in front of me, blocking my way. What's the matter, Naruto? Have I struck a nerve? Where's your anger? She asked, her eyes turning to slits. Jumping on top of her fist, I paused for a few seconds before jumping down. You don't really need to know. Quote. I said, before continuing into the tunnels, leaving the fox alone. Opening my eyes, I once again found myself in front of the statue in the cemetery. Looking around, I noticed that everyone who was visiting the cemetery before were gone, and it looked pretty late. Standing up and stretching, I left, walking down the quiet streets. Looking over to the Hokage's office, I saw that the lights were still on. Deciding to stop by, I made my way over to the building belonging to the Hokage. Entering the front door, I walked through the hallways before knocking on Granny Tsunade's door. A few seconds later, the door opened, and a shorter woman with black hair answered, looking at me in surprise. Hey, Shizune, is Granny Tsunade here? I asked, and she gave me an apologetic look. I'm sorry, but she has a lot of paperwork to do. Is there any way you could come back? She began before a voice from inside interrupted her, and I recognized the voice as Granny Tsunade. Shizune, who's at the door? Granny Tsunade asked, and Shizune flinched slightly. It's Naruto, my lady. I was just asking him if he could come back later as you are busy right now, she said. Naruto, send him in, Shizune, Granny Tsunade said, and Shizune frowned. But my lady, what about your, Shizune? Granny Tsunade interrupted, and Shizune sighed, opening the door to let me in. Giving her an apologetic look, I walked inside, seeing the Hokage behind her desk. So, what are you doing up at this hour? What can I do for you, Naruto? She asked, and I stayed silent for a few seconds before sighing. Do you have any records on my parents, like who they were? I asked. Her eyes widened, and her quill fell from her hand. Seeing this, I sighed. Not you, too. Every time I ask who my parents were, people always seem to dodge the question, I said, and she sat in silence for a few minutes before frowning. I'm sorry, Naruto, but I'm afraid that information has been sealed away, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. Sealed away? What do you mean? I asked, and she sighed, resting her elbows on her desk and steepling her hands in thought. The third Hokage apparently had those records sealed away, only to be opened when you were truly ready for that information. This was requested by your father himself right before he died, she said, and my shoulders sagged. I don't understand. I'm 19. Don't you think I'm ready enough to know who my parents are? I asked, and she frowned. Trust me, Naruto, if it was up to me, I would give you that information. After all you've done, I believe that you deserve to know, but I don't have the files to give you. Those files reside with the village elders. They are the ones who decide when you are ready. She said, I see. So, am I just supposed to sit back and wait patiently for them to decide I should know? You and I both know that that won't happen. In their eyes, no matter what I do, I will always be the kid with the 9 tails locked up inside. Him, I said, and she gave me a comforting look. Whatever happened to the boy who was always striving to be the next Hokage? Look, I'll talk to them and see about getting you those files. Why don't you go home and get some rest? You're obviously under quite a bit of stress, she said, and I shrugged, not really holding out much hope on getting the information I was looking for. Without another word, I nodded before heading out the door and heading home. Reaching my front door, I unlocked it before stepping inside. Sitting in bed, I took out the last remaining candle and lit it, placing it on my bedside table and staring into the dimly flickering light. Well, 19 years and I still don't know who you are, I said, gently resting my hand on my stomach. I wonder, if you were still alive when they decided to seal the 9 tails inside of me, would you have been okay with it? I asked before shaking my head. Probably not. Who would allow anything like that to happen to their own son? Laying down and closing my eyes, I soon drifted off to sleep. After what felt like a few minutes, I opened my eyes, expecting to awaken in bed, only to see that I was once again in my mind's scape. Sighing, I stretched. What do you want, Kurama? I asked, looking at the fox who was sitting nearby. You know, Naruto, I'm still surprised that you are even calling me by my name, she said, and I shrugged. Yeah, well, I guess I'm just not in the mood to try and get on your nerves. So, again, what is it that you want? I asked, and she nodded, giving me an uncharacteristic smile. You wanted to know about your parents, didn't you? She asked, and I looked up at her in shock. You know about my parents? I asked, and she scoffed. Of course. Now, if you want to hear it, shut up and listen. But, I warn you, you may not like truth. Are you positive you want to hear it? She asked, and I looked at her, determined. 19 years, that's how long I've lived, not even knowing the names. Of course, I want to know who they were, I said, and she nodded. Your mother, Kushina Uzumaki, or the Red Hot Habanero, as she was called, was a fiery young woman from the now long destroyed Uzumaki clan, brought to the Hidden Leaf because of a special chakra she possessed. Because of this special chakra, she became the second 9 tails Jinchuriki, she said, and I looked at her in shock. You were sealed inside my mom, I asked, and she nodded. That is correct. If I had to admit, she wasn't that bad of a Jinchuriki. It was certainly easier than being trapped in the mind of a male brat, she said, before continuing. Anyways, after being in the village for a while, the hidden cloud attempted to kidnap her to make it easier to harness my power. However, your father, Minato Namikaze, came to her rescue, she said, spitting his name. Minato Namikaze, I asked, and she sighed, giving me a look that told me to pay attention instead of asking questions. Yes, Naruto. Yet, he had other names. He was also called the Hidden Leaf's Yellow Flash, but what you may have heard him called as the 4th Hokage, she said, and my eyes widened. Shaking my head, I took a step back. And no, you're lying, I said, and she looked at me in confusion. I'm afraid I'm not, Naruto. What would I gain from lying about who your parents are? She asked, and I clenched my fists. So, what? Are you telling me that my parents sealed you inside of me? Why the hell would they do that? Didn't they know how much hate I would have to go through? I asked, and she took a deep breath. To save your worthless village, she shouted, and I froze, stunned for a few seconds. As much as I despise being sealed away inside of you and losing half my power, I have to respect them for sacrificing themselves like they did, and you should, too. After all, they put their faith of the future in you, she said, snapping me out of my self-pity. Sighing, I nodded. So, what was Dad like when he wasn't Hokage? I asked, and Kurama calmed down slightly. Minato was a kind person when he needed to be. A lot of people looked up to him, including your sensei, Kakashi, who trained under him. She said, and I nodded, making a mental note to ask him about my dad. Well, thanks, I guess, for telling me about my parents. I'm glad to have been able to learn who they were, but I guess I should be getting some actual sleep. I do have daily missions, I said, slowly turning around, when one of Kurama's tails wrapped around my ankle, causing me to trip and fall face first. And where do you think you're going? I'm not done with you yet, she said, her voice taking on a tone I had never heard before. Groaning, I rubbed my nose and looked at her in confusion, only to see that she had turned into the form she had used to tease me when I had turned 18. What was that for? I asked, but she stayed silent, slowly making her way over to me before straddling me. What are you doing? I asked, and she smirked, slipping down my pants. Finally understanding what was going on, I began to struggle. Get off me. Why are you doing this? I shouted, trying to shake her off, but her grip on me was too strong. Today's your birthday, right? She asked, and I continued struggling. Well, think of this as my gift to you, she said, slowly working my spiral pattern boxes down my legs and grabbing my member, which was getting hard against my best efforts. Stop, please. I want to save my first time for that pink-haired girl. She finished for me, pausing in her movements, though she still kept her hand wrapped around me. She looked into my eyes, and I could see a bit of pity in them. The same girl who you've chased after all your life, the one who uses you and still chases after that Sasuke brat, even though he's become a rogue ninja, she asked, and I sighed. That's I began, but Kurama shook her head. An unhealthy relationship, and you know it, she said, and I looked away. Just relax, Naruto, and enjoy yourself, she said, going back to stroking. When she deemed me hard enough, she grinned, slowly sliding down my body until her muzzle was right above my dick. Looking up at me, she grinned again before wrapping her muzzle around the tip. Expecting to feel sharp teeth, I scrunched my eyes shut, only to open them again when her tongue wrapped round it, and she began to suck. Without trying to, I moaned, and she smiled, letting out a noisy slurp. Losing myself in the pleasure, my hands found their way behind her head, pushing her down faster, causing her eyes to widen for a few seconds before slowly closing as she began to pick up speed. This continued for a few more minutes before a pressure began to build in the pit of my stomach. Kurama, something's coming, I gasped, and she opened her eyes and looked into mine for a few seconds before pulling away and swirling her tongue around the tip. That's right, Naruto, let it out. I want to taste it, she said, her words sending vibrations up my member. No longer able to hold myself back, I scrunched my eyes shut and pressed her head against me. Feeling my dick reach the back of her throat, I finally reached my release, humping against her muzzle. She moaned, eagerly swallowing around me to avoid any of my from spilling. After a few seconds, when I finished, she slowly pulled away, and I fell over backwards, out of breath. There, you got what you wanted. Am I able to go now? I asked, and she chuckled, licking her lips and giving me a look that instantly made me hard once again. How cute. You actually think we're done, she said, causing me to look at her in tired confusion as she slowly crawled her way up my body and looked into my eyes. No, the truth is, we're not even close to being done. You'd better prepare yourself because we're going until I'm satisfied, she said, positioning herself above me, my dick poking against her entrance. She leaned down close to me, looking into my eyes. You should count yourself lucky. You're the first person in history to get to mate the queen of the Bijuas, she said, before doing something that caught me completely off guard. Slamming herself down and taking me to the hilt, she pressed her muzzle to my lips, capturing my mouth with her own. Caught off guard, she took advantage of this by shoving her tongue into my mouth, tangling it with mine. After a few seconds, lost in the lust I felt, I wrapped my arms around her, returning the kiss. Beginning to thrust against me, she leaned back, her eyes half-lidded, and her tongue hanging out. Oh, you're certainly getting into this. Have you seriously forgotten about your one-sided crush on that pink-haired girl? She asked, looking at me teasingly. Jay, just shut up, I said, locking lips with her once again and flipping us onto our sides. She grunted into the kiss, wrapping her arms around me and closing her eyes. For the next couple minutes, we both fought to be the one on top. Rolling me onto my back, she grinned down at me. Come on, Naruto, you can be rougher. Or is that the best you've got? She teased, and I growled, tightening my grip on her with my arms, causing her to look at me in confusion. You want me to be rougher? How's this? I said, forming the hand signs for my shadow clone jutsu, calling up a single shadow clone. Looking back at it in confusion, she squealed in joy as the shadow clone took her from behind. Oh, yes, she moaned, her tongue hanging out as she was taken from both sides at the same time, being sandwiched between us. So, is that rough enough for you? I asked, and she leaned her head into the crook of my neck. See, careful, if you do that well, I may not let you go, she said, nibbling gently on my collarbone. In retaliation, I took her left breast into my mouth and twisting her right nipple. Suddenly, she let out a loud moan, and her _ began to ripple around me, my crotch becoming soaked. Pausing, I looked at her in confusion. Did you just? I began, and she glared at me before looking away. Shut up, Jay, just keep going, she said, looking uncharacteristically embarrassed. Deciding to go a lot slower, I dispelled my shadow clone, nearly coming right there as the pleasure my clone was feeling was transferred to me. Feeling the sudden emptiness, she groaned, but before she could complain, I brought her into a kiss, groping her breasts and tweaking her nipples, continuing to pump into her at a slow pace, causing her to moan. After a few minutes, that tightness in the pit of my stomach began to return, and I began to pant slightly, trying to hold out longer. Seemingly sensing that I was getting closer, she met my eyes with half-lidded ones. What, are you about to come? She asked, and I nodded, clenching my eyes shut. Then go ahead, come, she said, whispering in my ear before nibbling it. Grunting, I pumped for a few more seconds before she locked her legs around my back, and I finally reached my end. Thrusting in as deep as I could go, Kurama moaned as I came, and her twitching tunnel milked me for everything I had, her walls quickly being painted white. She wrapped her arms around me, pulling me close. A few seconds later, I sighed as my member started to soften inside of her before slipping out, a trail of _ slowly dribbling out behind it. How was that? Are you satisfied now? I asked with a cocky grin, only to be met with silence. Curious, I looked up only to see that her eyes were closed, and she was asleep. Scoffing, I rolled my eyes. Letting out a yawn of my own, I relaxed. I couldn't move or I would risk waking her up and possibly have to go again. Laying my head on the ground, I prepared to go to sleep. As I closed my eyes and drifted off, I could swear I saw two figures standing nearby. One, a guy with blonde hair, and the other, a woman with bright red hair. The guy looked shocked by what he saw, while the woman smiled, a look of acceptance on her face. When I looked again, they were gone. Shrugging, I closed my eyes again and fell asleep, Kurama's head nestled against my neck. Hearing the young ninjas in training making their way to the academy for their morning classes, I slowly opened my eyes and yawned, letting my eyes adjust to the morning light currently filling my room. Stretching, I winced as I was filled with a deep ache. Rubbing my back, I remembered my dream from last night. Standing up, I closed my eyes and leaned back, sighing in content as my back let out a loud pop. For just being a dream, I sure did feel weary, as if Kurama and I had really shaking my head to clear the thought away. I made my way to the drawer where I kept my cups of instant ramen. There was no way Kurama and I had did any of that last night. As far back as I could remember, the Nine Tails had always hated me, so showing any sexual feelings towards me was ridiculous. Not only that, but the idea that my father was the fourth Hokage. I chuckled to myself. I should really cut down on the ramen if that's what my mind thinks up. After the ramen finished and cooled down, I picked it up and headed to sit down on my bed. Turning towards the bed, I froze, the cup of noodles falling from my grasp, and my eyes widening at what I saw. Hey, it's about time. I was wondering when you'd notice me here, a voice said, and I could only stare in shock. Laying in bed, wrapped up in the blankets, was Kurama, still in her half-fox, half-human form, as well as in her black bra and panties. She looked at me with a grin, looking quite amused at my shock. Taking advantage of my paralyzed state, she slowly got out of bed and walked over to me, wrapping me with an arm and a tail, while slowly sliding her finger in circles around my chest. What, you didn't think you could mate with the queen of the Bijuas and run, did you? She asked, leaning down and whispering in my ear. Regaining my ability to move again, I leapt back, causing her to pout slightly. Kurama, what are you doing here? I thought that was just a dream. Actually. Scratch that. How are you here? The seal should have kept you from escaping. I demanded, and she chuckled. Oh. It was all too real, and may I just say it felt wonderful. She said, licking her muzzle. As for how I escaped, that's easy. I simply had to manipulate your hand while you slept to get you to release the seal on your stomach with some of my chakra. You know, you really shouldn't have fallen asleep so close to me like you did. She smirked, and I paled, running to the mirror and lifting my shirt. Looking at the seal, I immediately saw that the spiral was gone, instead being replaced by a large black circle, showing that the seal had indeed been released. Gulping, I slowly turned towards Kurama. So now that you're free, I assume you plan to destroy the village? I asked, realizing that she could go on a rampage at any moment. Seeing my nervousness, she rolled her eyes. Relax. I no longer wish to destroy the hidden leaf. I couldn't even if I wanted to, she said, mumbling the last part under her breath. What? I asked, looking at her in confusion, and she sighed. Sure. I may have been freed from the seal, but it still took a considerable amount of my chakra to free myself, and it has weakened me a bit. I currently don't have enough power to even try to destroy the village. She said, and I relaxed before she continued. However, don't think I'm powerless. I still have enough chakra to kill anyone who tries anything. She said, and I stiffened once again. So, if you aren't planning to destroy the village, what are you going to do? I asked, and she grinned, giving me a look that was oozing sexuality. Didn't I make it clear to you that you wouldn't be getting rid of me that easily? I'm sticking with you, and who knows, maybe if I'm feeling generous, I might even show you some pleasure. She said, giving me a lecherous look, eyes widening. I shook my head. What? You can't stay with me? I said, and she raised a brow at me inquisitively. Oh. And why, pray tell, is that? She asked, feigning interest, and I sighed. All my life, I've been ridiculed and hated because of you. If people discovered that you were free, they'd hate me even more for letting you loose. Don't you think I've been through enough already? I snapped, and she blinked before shrugging. If being ostracized by your village bothers you so much, why don't you just leave? Why stay with the people who treat you like an outsider? She asked, and I paused before looking down. I was born in this village. I belong here. Plus, I do have friends who I'd miss. And anyways, if I let those people get to me, and I leave the village, I wouldn't be a true shinobi. I said, and Kurama shook her head in disgust. They really have you brainwashed, don't they? She asked, and I looked at her in confusion. A shinobi never cries. A shinobi's emotions are weaknesses. If you ask me, that's a bunch of __, if you don't weep for a fallen comrade, if you don't accept your emotions, are you even human? As for these so-called friends, did any of them wish you a happy birthday? It seems to me that your friends avoid you, too, on that day, she said, and I stayed silent. Instead of answering, I picked up the wasted cup of noodles before throwing them in the trash and getting another. The whole time, she watched my every move. What are you doing? She asked as I poured the water into the new cup. I'm making myself some more ramen, since you made me drop my last cup. I said, and she looked at it in confusion. Ramen? She asked, and I looked at her in surprise before realizing she may have never had it before. Right, you've been locked away. Here, try some, I said, sighing and holding out the cup for her. She looked down at it for a few seconds before scoffing. HMPH, like I'd eat this human slop, she said, turning her head. Rolling my eyes, I continued to hold the cup. Oh, just shut up and try it, I snapped, and she actually looked surprised for a second. You said that you were planning on sticking with me, right? As much as I don't want you to, there's not many other options without you being seen. Well, if you're going to be staying with me, you better get used to ramen, because that's the only food I buy. I said, and she shrugged. Well, I guess it's a good thing I don't require food to survive. She said, closing her eyes and nodding, looking pretty proud, only to be interrupted a few seconds later by a loud growl from her stomach. Opening her eyes, she placed a hand on her stomach, looking confused. Well, that's new, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. What is hunger? Don't all living things get hungry? I asked, and she frowned. That's just it. I'm a demon. I shouldn't get hungry, she said, and I shook the cup slightly, gaining her attention. Sighing in disdain, she grabbed it. Hey, maybe this means you're no longer a demon, I said teasingly, and she glared at me, taking an experimental bite. Eyes lighting up, she began to scarf down the noodles. Sighing, I opened the drawer to get more ramen, only to groan when my hand came back empty. Oh, man, that was my last ramen, I said, before sighing, getting dressed in my orange and black jacket, as well as a pair of sweats. Finishing the food she had previously called slop, Kurama sighed in content before noticing me. What are you doing now? She asked, and I watched in irritation as she tossed the empty styrofoam cup on the floor. That was my last cup of ramen. Now I have to go out and pick up some more, I said, and she stretched before walking towards the door. Good, I guess I could use this as a chance to stretch my legs, she said. Getting in front of her, I held her back, standing in front of the door. Oh, no, you don't. You can't leave here right now. You'd cause a panic, I said, and she blinked, an uncaring look on her face. So, I should care why? She asked, and I glared at her. If you cause everyone to panic, the Anbu will be called. And as much as you may well love chaos, I'm sure you don't want them called on you, and neither do I said, and she fell silent, looking away in frustration. Just wait here, I'll be back, I said, and without waiting for an answer, I walked out the door, shutting it securely behind me. Walking into town, I made my way to the convenience store. Walking through the door, I was greeted by the man behind the register. Hey, if it isn't Naruto. You here to pick up more ramen? He asked, and I just nodded. Looking away, I rolled my eyes. Sure, you're being nice now, yet just yesterday you were all looking at me with distrust. Picking up a basket, I went down an aisle, placing a few packages of ramen in the basket. Paying the cashier, I exited the store before looking in my wallet. Deciding to make one more stop, I decided to head for the clothes store to pick up some new clothes for Kurama. After all, she wasn't going to be running around my house in her undergarments. Suddenly, someone called for me, catching my attention. Turning around, I saw a girl about my age with short red hair running towards me. Naruto, there you are, she said as she caught up to me. Looking at her in confusion for a few seconds, my eyes widened when I recognized her. Looking around, I saw a few people looking our way in surprise at her loud entrance before going back to their business. Turning back to her, I looked at her in frustration. Kurama, what are you doing here? I thought I said to stay at the house, I whispered urgently, and she shrugged, currently wearing a black t-shirt that I recognized as mine, as well as another pair of my sweatpants. Hey, you were taking too long, so I decided to come and find you, she said before looking at the bag in my hands. I see you got your ramen. Where are you going now? She asked, and I looked at her for a few seconds. She sure seems to be being clingy. Sighing, I gave up. I was heading to the clothes store to pick up some new clothes for you. I don't want you walking around me naked, I said quietly, and she pouted slightly. Oh, come on, you know you love it, she said teasingly, and I continued walking. Sighing when she realized I wasn't changing my mind, she continued walking at my side as we walked down the street. As we walked by the bar, someone called, and I recognized the voice. Turning to look, I saw the pervy sage sitting on a stool, his arm around a woman on his left. Hey kid, who's your friend? He said, giving me a wink, and I sighed, coming to a stop. Oh. Hey pervy sage. This is Kurama. I met her yesterday, I lied, and his grin slowly began to disappear. Kurama, Ha, he said to himself before turning to the woman next to him and giving her a smile. Excuse me, but I need to talk to my student for a bit, he said, placing some money down on the counter to pay for his drink, as well as some extra money to pay for her drink, before getting up and walking over to us. Follow me, he said, walking in the direction of the front gate without waiting for us to answer. Looking at Kurama, I gave a shrug before following. Eventually, after leading us to a quiet training ground, Pervy Sage sighed. Right, you can drop that transformation jutsu now. We're out of the public view, he said, without turning around. My eyes widened, while Kurama grinned, releasing her human guise with a hand sign. I'm impressed you could see through my disguise, though. I guess you aren't one of the 3 legendary Sannin for nothing, she said, leaning against a tree. Please, I didn't even have to try. Your name was enough to tip me off. After all, you were originally locked inside Kushina, so I made sure to learn all I could about you, he said, before turning to look at me, his eyes cold. As for you, Naruto, I have never been more disappointed in you. How could you release the seal and put the village in danger like that? Have you no sense at all? He asked, anger in his voice. Kurama's grin faded, and she stood up, walking over to him. Hey, watch it, you old codger. With the way everyone has treated Naruto, you should be proud of the fact he hasn't torn that seal off before. As for your little village, I have no intention of destroying it. You, on the other hand, I don't like you. I have no problem killing you, she said, and I looked at her in surprise at her sticking up for me. Pervy Sage looked from Kurama to me, before grinning. You've really fallen hard, haven't you? He asked, looking at her, and she glared at him. Shut it, she growled, gritting her teeth. Turning to me, he gestured to me. Naruto, come over here and raise your shirt, he said, and I looked at him in confusion for a few seconds, though I still did what he said. You already know the seal has been undone, though, I said, and he sighed. I know, but I'm not interested in the seal. Now, turn around and lift your shirt, he said, and I frowned before doing as I was told. A few seconds later, he turned to Kurama. Just as I thought, you even marked him. Tell me, have you been feeling strange? Maybe feeling like something is different, he asked, and she looked away, grinding her teeth. Confused, I looked at him in confusion. Marked? I asked, and he pointed at Kurama. Ask her, she's the one that marked you. However, right now, I'm afraid you have to leave, he said, and I looked at him in confusion. Leave? What do you mean? I asked, and his gaze went cold once again. The village. You have to leave the village. As long as the QB is free of the seal, you can't stay in the village, and currently, there is no way to reseal her, he said, turning his back on me and facing the village. Eyes widening, I looked at him in shock. Wait, exile. But I was born here. Where else am I supposed to go? I demanded, and he shook his head. Be glad that's what I'm suggesting. Anyone else would have branded you a traitor and locked you both up, but your father wouldn't have wanted that. I suggest you go back home and pack up the necessities you'll need, then leave, he said, before heading back to the village. Watching him go, I stood there in silence for what felt like hours, before I was finally able to get my legs to move. Kurama in her human guise, we walked back to my now old house, her being uncharacteristically quiet. Opening my door, I entered slowly. Passing by my mirror, I paused before lifting my shirt and looking over my shoulder at my back. Seeing the large symbol, I couldn't help but stare. On my back, there was a large red design resembling that of the head of a fox with 9 flaming tails behind it. Seeing the blank look on my face, Kurama sighed. Would you like me to explain it? She asked, her voice soft, free of her normal teasing. Without looking away from the mirror, I nodded. Knowing more about why I am being exiled would be good, I said, and she frowned before taking a deep breath. It's called a mate mark. It's something all Bijuas are capable of giving to their Jinchuriki hosts. It is a sign that the Bijuas and their Jinchuriki host have formed a special kind of bond. Think of it as a contract of sorts. Now, depending on the power of the Bayu, they can use this mark to escape from their host at the cost of most of their power. In other words, they become alive, she said, and I nodded. You mean like needing food? I asked, and she nodded. Exactly. Basically, We sacrifice our demonic forms for a more earthly form in order to gain freedom. What we do with said freedom is up to us, whether we decide to stay with our new partner or get rid of the mark and go our separate ways. She said, and I turned to look at her. Wait, so you could get rid of the mark? I asked, and she hesitated for a few seconds before frowning. I could. If you wanted, I could get rid of the mark for you, and we could go our separate ways. Is that what you want? She asked, and I thought for a few seconds. What else is the mark for? What does it do? I asked, and she sat down on the bed. It lets others know that we are mates. It also links us together, body and soul, she said, and upon seeing my confusion, she elaborated. In other words, only I could bring you to pleasure, and likewise, only you could pleasure me, she said before giving me time to digest this information. So, is that something you'd be interested in, or would you rather me remove the mark? She asked, and I sighed, finally stepping away from the mirror. You know, I should really count myself lucky, I said, and she looked at me in confusion. Not the being exiled thing, but the fact that there's a girl actually interested in me. Not only that, but she knows all about me, I said, and she tilted her head slightly. Does that mean you're keeping the mark? She asked, actually looking hopeful. I might as well. I mean, even if the mark was removed, it still wouldn't change the fact that I've been exiled, I said, and she surprised me by bringing me into a hug. Shocked by the sudden act, I awkwardly wrapped my arms around her. So, is there anything special that needs to be done to make it official? I asked, and she shook her head, still embracing me. Nope, the mark takes care of everything, unless you count consummating things, she said, her voice once again dripping with desire. Separating from her and causing her to pout, I reached under my bed, pulling out the suitcase I always brought with me when I went on long missions, and began to pack up my things. Right, well that can wait. First, we need to find a new place to stay, I said, and she sighed, beginning to help me pack up. When we finished, and the room was now looking clean, I forced the bag closed, and began wheeling it towards the door. Passing by the mirror, I once again paused, this time looking at my headband. Frowning, I took it off, flipping it around in my hand a few times, before tossing it on my bed. Eyes widening, Kurama ran over to the bed and picked the headband up, looking at me in shock. Naruto, wasn't the proudest moment of your life when you became a ninja? This headband was proof of that moment. I know you're upset about all that's happened, but are you really going to get rid of this that easily? She asked, bringing it back and setting it in my hand, and I sighed. You're right, but I can't wear this. I'm no longer a leaf shinobi, I said, placing it in my bag. She frowned slightly, but didn't say anything. Let's go now, I said, taking one last look at my house before turning around and walking towards the gate. As we made it to the gate, someone called me, and I turned around, only to recognize the pink-haired girl running up to us. Beside me, Kurama tensed up slightly. Naruto, Sakura called before coming to a stop in front of us, catching her breath. Are you going on a mission or something? Where's the rest of your squad? She asked, and I sighed. Oh. Hey Sakura, I'm leaving, I said, and she blinked. I get that, but what time do you think you'll be getting back? The others and I felt bad for not being there on your birthday yesterday, and we were planning a little celebration for you today, she said, and I frowned, shaking my head. I'm not coming back, I said, and she looked at me in confusion, which slowly turned to shock as I continued. The seal containing the 9 tails has been undone, and I've been exiled by the pervy sage, I said, and Sakura looked at me with wide eyes before shaking her head. There has to be some kind of mistake. Does Lady Sunad know about this? I'm sure if you talk to her about it, you could, she started, but I shook my head. Stay. No. I just get even more hate from the village. Just tell the others I said goodbye, okay? I said, before turning around and walking out the front gate, Sakura watching in shock. As we walked far enough away from the village and entered the woods, Kurama dropped her guise, returning to her ox-like form. So, where do we go now? She asked, and I sighed, thinking to myself as we jumped from branch to branch. Well, there's one place I know where we might be able to stay for at least tonight, I said, and she looked at me in silence for a few seconds before shrugging, following me. Making up my mind, we began to head west towards a friend I knew we could trust. Jumping from branch to branch, Kurama and I traveled west, the Hidden Leaf village quickly getting farther and farther behind us. An hour having passed since we had set out. Every few minutes, she would look over at me, a frown on her face. "Hey Naruto, how you feeling?" she asked, and I was once again reminded that the previously fierce fox demon was now free and surprisingly worried about me. Sighing, I shook my head, keeping my eyes forward. "I don't know. Lost, I guess. I never would have expected getting exiled like this. Ever since I became a ninja, I put my all into protecting the village and completing missions, even while being disrespected by the other villagers. But in the end, I guess it didn't even matter," I said, and she frowned slightly. "I guess you must hate me, at least a little, right? After all, I did get you thrown out of your home," she said, and I remained quiet for a minute before letting out a sigh. "I still have the mate mark, even though you offered me the chance to get rid of it, right? That should be proof enough that I don't hate you," I said, and she nodded, looking away and trying to hide a look of relief. "Though I do find it amusing in some depressing way. If you would have just stayed home and waited for me to get back, we may still be in the village," I said, and she flinched. "Right," she said, falling silent for a few minutes before looking back at me. "So, where exactly are we going? You mentioned a place we could go to stay at least a night, but you never said where," she said, and I looked over to her, giving her a weak smile. "I was thinking the Hidden Sand Village," I said, and she nodded before looking thoughtful for a few seconds. "Wait, isn't that where the Jinchuriki brat, Gaara, lives?" she asked, and I sighed, rolling my eyes. "Do you have to call everyone a brat?" I asked, and she smiled slightly. "Of course, like I told you a year ago, compared to me, everyone is a kid or a brat. Don't get me wrong, though. I didn't mean that as an insult. From what I know about him, which is only what you know about him, he seems like he's a decent friend," she said, and I looked at her in surprise for a few seconds. "I believe that's the first time I've heard you talk positively about someone, you know," I said, and she self-consciously looked away. "But, you're not wrong. He is a good friend. He's the only person I can really turn to right now, as he understands how hard it can be," I said, and she nodded, once again looking ahead. Eventually, after having been traveling for nearly 2 hours, Kurama's ears swiveled back and twitched, and she frowned. "Naruto," she said, and I frowned as well, giving a nod. "I know," I said. During my time traveling around with the pervy sage, I had gained quite a lot of knowledge and skills, including some sensory abilities. While I was not a sensory ninja, and couldn't quite track people, I could still tell when I was being followed, and right now, we were being followed. Focusing hard, I could sense at least 4 shinobi, and by the feel of it, they were gaining on us. Looking around, I spotted a clearing a little farther ahead. "Let's head for that clearing. We'll confront them there," I said, and Kurama looked at me in surprise. "Confront them? Not that I don't like some good violence, but shouldn't we avoid a fight until we get some medical supplies? The Uzumaki might have been known for their strong recovery abilities, but we still should avoid fighting for right now. Keep in mind, I'm no longer locked inside of you, so I can no longer heal you, either," she said, and I smiled. "Relax. If it's ninjas from the Hidden Leaf Village, there won't be a fight. We're too close to the border. A fight could cause a war between the Land of Fire and the Land of Wind, and the Hidden Leaf knows that," I said, and Kurama looked impressed. Using the threat of possible war to avoid a fight. Clever. However, I do have one question. What if our pursuers aren't from the Hidden Leaf? She asked, as we jumped down into the clearing, preparing to meet face to face with the ninjas shadowing us. "Well, I have no doubts in my training, and even without a lot of your chakra, I know you're still a force to be reckoned with. Wouldn't you agree? And anyways, I'm sure I could explain what happened when we see Gaara," I said. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, the sound of rustling in the tree branches got closer, and we faced the trees. To my surprise, besides 2 Anbu, the 2 people I would never expect hopped down next to the 2 masked figures. "Kakashi-sensei, Lady Tsunade," I said. Kurama smirked, looking at the Hokage. "Wow, We must be very important if the Hokage herself left the safety of her office. She said, her smirk widening when the Anbu took a collective step forward, their hands resting on the sheathed swords attached to their backs. You know, I have no problem fighting in self-defense, but look around. Is it really a good idea to fight this close to the border? I asked, my hand near my kunai pouch in case a fight did break out. Tsunade's eyes narrowed, and she raised a hand to signal the Anbu to remain still before she took a step forward. Naruto, there's no need for this. Sakura told me that Jiraiya exiled you from the village, and I had a long talk with him about that. He had no right to make that decision. You are free to come back to the village. In fact, I also had a chance to talk to the village elders about unsealing your parents' records, and after a lot of consideration, they agreed. I'll tell you what, if you come back to the village, I will personally hand you their records. Deal? She asked, looking at me confidently, as if she was sure she had won me over. I just looked at her blankly for a few seconds before sighing. Minato Namikaze, the yellow flash of the leaf. Kushina Uzumaki, the red-hot habanero. I said, and Tsunade's eyes widened, as well as Kakashi's, who had taken a few steps forward to stand beside the Hokage, his Sharingan uncovered and trained on Kurama. How did you learn that? That information was classified, she said, and I rolled my eyes. Kurama actually cared enough to tell me the truth, I said, and Tsunade blinked in shock before composing herself. Okay, so you know who your parents were, but what about your dream? Isn't your dream to become Hokage? Well, that can't happen if you don't come back to the village. Are you willing to just abandon your dream? She asked, and I actually chuckled, much to her confusion. One day, I'm going to be Hokage. Then, everyone will look up to me and respect me, I said, mimicking my previous self, and Tsunade nodded. Dead. I was such an idiot for thinking that way, I said, and everyone looked at me in shock, including Kurama. Why would I ever think that people would just magically respect me just because I was Hokage? No, I'm not returning to the village. You're free to try and take me back by force, but only if you're willing to risk a war between the two feudal lands. I said, and Tsunade sighed. Last chance, Naruto. Return to the village, and I will make sure that you and Kurama are safe. If you don't, your exile will be made official. If you are seen near the village, you will be considered an enemy. I don't want to have to do this, but I will if I have to. Either your loyalties lie with the village, or they don't. She said, and I scoffed. Please, you wouldn't be able to keep your word about safety. If you tried, you'd be ousted as Hokage for putting the village in danger. I'll take my chances, I said, and she frowned before turning away. Very well, have it your way. The ninjas of the Hidden Leaf Village will be told to attack on sight. From this day on, you are not a ninja of the Hidden Leaf, but a rogue ninja. She said, before gesturing for the others to follow her. The two Anbu looked at each other for a few seconds before leaping after her into the branches of the trees. Only Kakashi stuck around, looking between us with his Sharingan before covering it again. Naruto, he said, and I sighed. What, are you going to try and get me to return, or here, these are for you? He said, holding out a kunai with a wooden handle and a scroll of some kind. What are those? I asked, looking at him before looking at his outstretched hands hesitantly. He sighed, continuing to hold them out. The kunai was a gift from my sensei, your father. He gave it to me when I became a jonin, and I've kept it since. I was planning on passing it to you when you became a jonin, but it looks like the time to give it to you has come early. He said, and I hesitantly walked forward and grabbed it, nearly dropping it in surprise at the weight. I know, it's heavier than usual, but that brings me to the scroll. This scroll contains the jutsu that gave your father the name, the yellow flash of the leaf. He said, and Kurama looked interested. You mean the flying Raijin technique? She asked, and he looked momentarily surprised. Quote, yes. Even though the second Hokage was the one who created the technique, Minato Sensei was able to improve it and add his own variations to it. He said, passing me the sealed scroll. He always meant for you to get this scroll and learn the technique so you could continue his legacy and protect the village. I guess you just got it too late. Anyways, I should catch up to Tsunade and the others before they start wondering where I am. Listen, I really am sorry to see you go, but I'm not going to try to stop you. If you believe this is the right path, then take it. Where that path may lead, I don't know. All I do know is that everything happens for a reason, he said, before turning and getting ready to leap into the trees. Hey, Kakashi-sensei, I asked, and he paused, looking back questioningly. Thank you for these and for teaching me a lot of what I know. Do you think you can do me a favor? Can you tell the others I'm sorry for not exactly saying goodbye? Especially Konohamaru. Tell him I said to train hard and I better hear that he became Hokage one day. Also tell Iruka-sensei that I'm thankful for him believing in me. I said, and Kakashi-sensei looked at me for a few seconds before nodding, smiling under his mask, visible eye closed. Will do, Naruto, and good luck, he said, before taking off into the trees. Watching him leave view, I sighed, putting the jutsu scroll in my pack and my father's kunai in my kunai po. Yuke before turning in the opposite direction and facing the border, beginning to walk as the trees began thinning out a little farther ahead. Well, let's get going, I said, and she nodded, smiling to herself reassuringly. Looking sideways at her, I looked at her in confusion. What are you smiling about? I asked, and she just kept smiling. Oh, nothing. Just I was beginning to worry about you. That's all. The way you were so willing to leave behind your headband this morning and the way you seemed to so easily give up your dream. I was worried that you may have been giving up, that you had lost what makes you who you are. But with how much you seem to care about the others just now, that shows that you are still your old self, she said, and I remained quiet. After a few seconds of silence, she frowned. Am I wrong? She asked, now looking worried. I don't know. You may have been right. If I'm no longer Naruto Uzumaki of the Leaf, who am I? I asked, and she looked at me in shock for a few seconds before rolling her eyes. Oh, come on. Are you actually questioning who you are? Do you even need to? She asked, and I looked at her in confusion. You may not be Naruto Uzumaki of the Leaf, but you are Naruto Uzumaki, one of the remaining few who have the proud Uzumaki lineage running through their veins. You are Naruto Uzumaki, son of Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki, something you should be proud of. You are Naruto Uzumaki, the one who showed me kindness even after all the __ I put you through. Last but not least, and you should feel honored, she said, giving me a nudge. You are Naruto Uzumaki, maid of Kurama, queen of the Bijuas, she said, and I looked at her for a few seconds before rolling my eyes and chuckling. Oh, of course, your majesty. I feel so honored, I said sarcastically, giving her an exaggerated bow, and she chuckled as well. Feeling a bit better, I gave her a weak smile. Thanks, I said honestly, and she looked over at me as we walked. I guess sometimes I need to be reminded of the good things I have in life. Though I do still find it weird that you're being nice to me now after the way you used to be, I said, and she quirked an eyebrow. Oh, would you rather I acted aggressive like I used to? She teased, and I quickly shook my head. No, I wasn't complaining. I just thought it was a bit strange, that's all, I said, and she sighed. When you came into your mindscape and changed the cage to a forest, I just figured you didn't really deserve all the hostility I was giving you, she said, and I nodded. Now that you seem less hostile, can I ask you a question? I asked, and she once again quirked an eyebrow. Did you honestly mean to destroy the Hidden Leaf Village 19 years ago? And this time, can you answer without your pride getting in the way? I asked, and she sighed, looking straight into my eyes, not a hint of regret in her red irises. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry for the attack? That I never meant to hurt anyone? Well, I can't. Was a demon. I'm not going to lie to comfort you by saying that it was all some horrible mistake. The truth of the matter is that at one point, I was set free from the masked man's control while I tore through the village. Though, putting my pride aside, I will apologize for the death of your parents, as I'm sure you are still grieving for them somewhere inside, she said, forcing the word out of her mouth as if it was hard for her to say. Suddenly, she looked thoughtful for a few seconds before snickering at whatever she was thinking about. Glaring at her, I shook my head. What? So, now it's funny that my parents are dead? I asked, and her eyes widened. And no, I just thought of something funny, she said, catching her breath. Your parents expected the seal to hold me, for me to try and attack you all the time. Yet here we are now as having had sex and me marking you as my mate. She said, chuckling, I bet if they could see us now, they'd be devastated. She said, and I blinked, thinking back to the two figures I had seen before falling asleep last night. I don't know about that, I said hesitantly, and she slowly caught her breath before looking at me in confusion. What are you talking about? She asked, and I looked away. You know how after both of us finished up last night, we both fell asleep? I asked, and she nodded. Well, I could just have been seeing things, but I could swear I saw two people standing there watching us. I said, and she looked at me for a long few seconds before a look of realization crossed her face. Well, if that's not the most awkward thing, having sex in front of your parents while they watch. I bet they were mortified. She said, and I shook my head. Not really. The man just looked surprised, while the woman seemed to accept what was happening. I said, before sighing. So, were they really my parents? I asked, and she shrugged. I wouldn't be surprised. They designed the seal after all. I have no doubts that they found a way to seal part of their souls in as well so they can help if the seal ever weakened, which it did last night when I gave you that mate mark. What does surprise me though is that they'd be accepting. She said, before shrugging again. Finishing that line of conversation, we continued walking, and by the time we reached the edge of the desert, the sun began to sink and the temperature began to drop. Looking around, I recognized this is the area we had entered the desert when we had been called to go and join the hidden sand village when rumors of the Akatsuki planning an attack on them had begun to spread. Realizing that it was getting too dark to see far, I frowned. Follow me. We're going to need to make a camp. I know of a little cave at the edge of the desert just up ahead. I said, and she nodded, beginning to collect twigs and branches. What are you doing? I asked, and she paused. I'm collecting firewood. If we're going to be staying in a cave for the night, won't we need a fire to see? She asked, and I nodded. I guess that's true. I didn't think of that. I said, before looking at her in confusion. Wait, you know fire style? I asked, and she nodded. Of course I do, she said, looking proud. As she continued to pick up firewood, I looked at her in curiosity. So, as Queen of the Bijuas, are you able to use all of the different chakra natures? I asked, and she began to laugh, rolling her eyes. I wish, but no. Just because I'm the Queen of Bijuas doesn't mean I can do the impossible. She said, before looking thoughtful. Well, impossible to all but old man's 6 paths. She said, before shrugging. Anyways, I only have wind and fire chakra natures. She said, and I nodded in understanding. So, where's this cave? She asked, and I pointed at an outcropping of rocks farther ahead. Just up ahead. We're almost there, I said, and she nodded, following me. By the time we made it to the small cave, the full moon was high in the sky, its milky light causing the sand to appear to glow. Making our way into the cave, Kurama began to set the branches and sticks into a pile, before weaving a few hand signs, before lighting them on fire with a small fireball. Sighing, I set my backpack down, before sitting down close to the fire. Taking a quick look outside the cave, she sat down next to me, wrapping a tail around me. Feeling a bit off-put by how close she was, I looked at her sideways. You're not going to jump me like last night, are you? I asked, and she blinked, her tail loosening its grip on me slightly. No, unless you want to. I am looking forward to consummating things, but I think that'd be better in an actual bed, don't you think? She asked, and I relaxed slightly, giving her a weak smile. After a few seconds of looking into the crackling fire, she blinked as if an idea had come to her, and she looked at me. Hey, Naruto, she said, and I looked back at her. What would you say if I offered you a new summons? She asked, and I sat up straight, looking at her in confusion. New summons? I asked, and she nodded, snapping her fingers and causing a scroll to appear. Opening it, she laid it across the floor of the cave. Looking at it, I was surprised to see only 2 signatures on the scroll. Seeing my surprise, she smiled. This is the summoning contract of the foxes. This is very rare, and not too many people know about this summon. In fact, the only ones who knew about it were the Sage of 6 Paths and his son. She said, giving me a few seconds to let that information sink in. I was given this scroll to keep it safe, and it's been with me ever since. She said, waiting for my answer. I looked between her and the scroll a few times before finally focusing on her. And you're letting me sign it, too? I asked, and she smiled, giving a nod. Feeling excited, I got ready to bite my finger to draw blood before a thought came to mind. What about Gamatsu and Gamakichi? I asked, and she looked confused before realization crossed her face. Your Toad summons, she asked before sighing. I'm afraid that if you sign this contract, your name would be removed from the Toad's contract as you can't have multiple types of summons. But maybe it would be for the best, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. What do you mean? I asked, and she frowned. Well, the Toads are loyal to the leaf, right? She asked, and I nodded. Wouldn't it be a conflict of interest if a summon loyal to the leaf helps someone not from the leaf? She asked, and I sighed. I guess that's true. So, who are the fox summons loyal to? I asked, and she smiled, placing a hand on my shoulder. That's the beauty of the fox summons. They'll be loyal to their summoner, no matter what village, nation, or area they are from. She said, and I nodded, looking thoughtful. I suppose I'll sign it then, I said, biting my finger and writing my name out in the blood before spreading the blood to my other fingers and pressing them against the paper. Wiping my fingers off, I sat up, looking over the scroll. She smiled before rolling it up and snapping her fingers, sending the scroll away. Looking at her for a few seconds, I blinked. So, should I try to summon a fox now? I asked, and she shook her head. No, you had a long day today, and tomorrow we have to make the walk to the hidden sand village. You need to rest. We could try and summon a fox tomorrow, she said, and as if her words had called it forth, I let out a yawn, realizing for the first time how tired I was. Nodding, I reached into my backpack before my eyes widened. Shit, I said, and she looked at me in confusion. I knew I was forgetting something. I forgot my blanket and pillow, I said, and she only smiled, scooting closer to me and moving a tail behind me. Lay down, she said, and I looked at her strangely before doing what she said. As I lowered my head, she slid her tail behind it until my head was resting on it. Afterwards, she wrapped her remaining tails around me like a makeshift blanket. Looking down at me, she smiled. How's that? She asked, and I looked up at her. Good, thank you, but what about you? I asked, and she laid down against me. I guess I'll just have to use you for warmth and as for a pillow. She trailed off, laying her head on my chest, her ear against my heart. She gave a contented sigh, and I smiled, wrapping my arm around her. I guess this will do, I said, and she just closed her eyes, her tails tightening around me slightly. Closing my eyes as well, I got ready for my first night as a rogue ninja. Mumbling slightly as I slowly woke up, I became aware of what felt like someone rubbing me on top of the head. Opening my eyes, I looked up, only to see Kurama absent-mindedly petting my head, a smile on her face. Blinking, she looked down at me, and upon seeing that I was awake, her eyes widened, and her smile vanished as she pointedly looked away, blushing slightly. Oh, good morning, Naruto, she said, clearing her throat awkwardly, and I looked at her in confusion for a few seconds. Were you just petting me? I asked, feeling more confused than upset. Blushing again, she quickly shook her head. And no, maybe you imagined it, she said, and I gave her a deadpan look before shaking my head and rolling my eyes, deciding that this was something I was probably going to have to get used to with her around. Whatever. Anyways, are you hungry? I asked, and her stomach growled in response. Taking that as an answer, I stretched, separating from her tails and reaching for my backpack. Looking inside, I frowned, as the only food I had was dry ramen and wrapped loaves of uncut bread. Sighing, I held out one of the loaves of bread for her. Here, not sure if you'll like it plain, but it's all I have besides dry ramen, I said, and she took it, giving it a curious look before taking a bite, shrugging a few seconds later. It's okay. So, do you want to try summoning a fox now? She asked, taking another bite of her bread, and I walked towards the mouth of the cave. Already, I could feel the temperature beginning to rise as the sun climbed higher into the sky. It was already slightly past mid-morning. Turning and stretching once again, I shook my head, much to her confusion. It's already getting late into the morning. Maybe if I woke up earlier, I could have tried it, but if we want to make it to the hidden sand village before it gets too hot, we should start heading out now. I could always try when we get there, I said, and she nodded, standing up as I grabbed my backpack before following after me as I began walking. So, how big do these foxes get? The toads can get pretty large. I just don't want to summon a fox and have it cause damage to the hidden sand village, I said, and she looked thoughtful. Well, some of them are pretty big, she said, before noticing my look of apprehension. But you shouldn't have to worry about summoning them unless you're in sage mode, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. Sage mode? I asked, and she blinked before frowning. I would have thought that old pervert would have taught you about sage mode, she said, shaking her head. Remind me to take you to the land of tofu, she said, before sighing. Anyways, sage mode is a state that can be reached by mixing nature energy and your own chakra in order to make a new chakra called sage jutsu chakra. In sage mode, you can get new techniques, as well as make yourself even stronger, she said, and I frowned. Why wouldn't the pervy sage teach me about sage mode? That sounds pretty awesome, I said, and she looked away. Well, it can be dangerous taking in nature energy, so that could be why he didn't mention it, she said. I looked at her questioningly for a few seconds and she sighed. Taking in too much of it can cause mutation, she said, and I stayed silent for a few seconds. Mutation? What do you mean? I asked. Well, if you train under the fox sage, if you take in too much nature energy, you can completely turn into a fox, losing all that made you human, she said, and I nodded silently, thinking about the risks before shrugging. So, when can I start learning how to enter sage mode? You seem to know a lot about it. Are you able to teach me? I asked, and she looked at me in surprise for a few seconds before chuckling. Still eager to get stronger, are you? Unfortunately, I wouldn't be the one teaching you. We would have to go to the land of tofu, she said. You keep saying that, but what is the land of tofu? I've never heard of that place, I said, and she smiled. You wouldn't find it on a map. The land of tofu is like the Toad's Mountain Myoboku. It is an island where the foxes reside and its location has been kept secret, she said before looking serious. Now, if I show you the island, you can't tell anyone where it is or anything about it. It is a location that has been untouched by humans, and I would rather it stay that way. Got that? She asked, and I nodded. Smiling once again, she nodded in satisfaction. Good, she said before falling silent as we continued onto the hidden sand. Shikamaru's POV. Standing outside of Naruto's house, I sighed, knocking for the 5th time on his door. Nobody around the village had seen him since yesterday, and as much of a drag it was to walk all the way over here, I decided to check on him. Even though he generally stayed to himself, it was unusual not to at least see him wandering around the village. Oh. Come on, Naruto. I know you're in there. Don't tell me you're upset we weren't around on your birthday. Quote, I said, getting nothing but silence. Frowning, I began to get the feeling something was wrong. Trying the doorknob, I blinked in confusion when I found that it was unlocked. Hey, Naruto, are you okay? I asked before looking around. Naruto wasn't here. In fact, none of his things were here. His house was empty. It was as if no one was living here. Concerned, I decided to ask Lady Tsunade if she knew where Naruto was. Making my way to the Hokage's office, I knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, Lady Shizune opened it. Oh. Good morning, Shikamaru, she said, and I nodded. Good morning. Is Lady Tsunade here? I asked, and she nodded, opening the door for me. She is. She was just about to call for you, she said, before turning around. My lady, Shikamaru is here to see you, she called. Looking at her in confusion for a few seconds, I walked in. Lady Tsunade was at her desk. However, instead of being busy with paperwork, she looked troubled. Looking up, she sighed. Hey, Shikamaru, I was just about to call for you. It's about Naruto, she said, and I straightened up, my attention on her. That's why I'm here. No one has seen him since yesterday, and when I went to check on him, his house was empty. Do you know where he is? I asked, and she sighed, steepling her hands. He's gone. He's been exiled. As for where he is, When the Anbu and I last saw him, he was at the border between us and the land of wind. She said, and my eyes widened. What? Why would you exile him after everything he's done for the village? I asked, and she frowned, standing up and looking out at the village through the window. Look, I offered him the chance to return, but he refused. I didn't want to exile him, but the point of the matter is that he put the village in grave danger. She said, and I opened my mouth, looking at her in shock. What did he do? I asked, unable to picture Naruto doing anything that would bring the village he loved to any kind of danger. The Nine Tails is no longer sealed away. Naruto released the seal, she said, clenching her fist. Did you ask him why? I mean, hasn't the Nine Tails tried to escape before? Isn't it possible it managed to escape this time? I asked, and Tsunade sighed. Maybe, but Naruto seemed pretty chummy with her. She said, her eyes darkening. Do you understand now why he's been exiled? Like I said before, I offered him the chance to return, but he already made up his mind. He turned his back on the village, and in turn, has chose the life of a rogue ninja. She said, sitting back down. I stammered, trying to decide what to think. Anyways, it's too late now. I really don't like making this decision, but I need you to let the others know that if Naruto is seen near T. He village, they are to attack on sight and drive him away. She said, and my head snapped up so I could look at her. Having made up my mind, I shook my head. No, I will not, I said, and she looked at me in shock. What, are you saying that you're going to ignore a direct order from your Hokage? She asked, and I turned around, walking towards the door. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm not done yet, she shouted, and I stopped for a few seconds. Don't get me wrong, if Naruto actually made an attempt to harm the village, I would lay my life on the line to stop him. I wouldn't even hesitate, but I will not harm someone who hasn't done anything, especially a friend. As for not wanting to come back, can you blame him? Ever since I can remember, people treated him with fear and hatred. Even his own friends avoided him on his birthday. Would you be willing to return to that? I asked, and she remained quiet. Now, are you going to exile me, too, for disobeying you? If so, prepare to exile all of Naruto's friends, because none of us are going to follow that order. I said, before walking out, leaving Tsunade in silence. Quickly making my way into the village, I began looking for the others. Passing by the Yakiniku queue, I heard Choji. Walking inside, I saw that not only was Choji here, but Iruka-sensei and the others, as well. The only one not here was Sakura. Looking up, Choji waved. Shikamaru, come on, sit down. Iruka-sensei is buying, he said, and Iruka's sweat dropped. Just try not to get too much, he said, and I gave him a sympathetic look, before remembering why I was here in the first place. That can wait, it's Naruto, I said, and Iruka looked at me in confusion. Is he okay? He asked, and Neji nodded, looking concerned. Yeah, where is he? Sakura went to get him yesterday for the party, but I haven't seen either of them since. He said, Naruto has been exiled. Lady Tsunade has declared him a rogue ninja. I said, and Iruka dropped his chopsticks, looking shocked, and the group grew silent. And Naruto? Hinata whispered, the color draining from her face. What? Why? Iruka demanded, and I sighed, lowering my voice as other people began to look. Apparently, the seal holding the Nine Tails has been undone. Tsunade says that she gave him a chance to return, but he refused. He was last seen near the Land of Wind's border, but Tsunade is already planning on telling us all to attack him on sight if he is seen near the village. I said, and Neji scoffed. Has she gone insane? None of us would attack him. He said, and I agreed. I said the same thing. Naruto has done so much for this village and for us. I certainly wouldn't attack him like she wants. I said, and Iruka stood up. Well, I'm going to see if I can go talk to Tsunade about all this. He said, setting money on the table for the food before walking out. Taking this time to sit down, I sighed. We're going to go find Naruto, aren't we? Choji asked, and I looked up in surprise. I'm in if you two are going. We already lost Sasuke. I'd hate to lose another friend. Ino chimed in, and I blinked before sighing again. Yeah, but not to bring him back, I said, and everyone looked at me in surprise. What do you mean? Hinata asked, her eyes wide, and I frowned. Think about it. Naruto has been branded as a rogue shinobi. He'd only be attacked if he came back. And even if Lady Tsunade were to change her mind, the Nine Tails has still been released, and the only person who knew how to seal it away in the first place was the fourth Hokage, and he's dead. The village would never accept him back anyways. If we go looking for Naruto, it would be to say goodbye. I said, and Hinata looked down at the table. In that case, may I come along, too? I would like to see Naruto again, she said, and Neji shook his head. Hinata, you can't. You're a part of the main branch, and you have a reputation to keep for the Hyuga clan. You can't just up and leave the village. He said, it's not up to you, Neji, she said, raising her voice slightly before quieting down again. I claim to like Naruto, yet I wasn't even there for him on his birthday. I want to apologize to him, she said, and Neji stayed quiet. Frowning, I stood up. Well, if we're going, we should start getting ready before Lady Tsunade decides to put us all under watch. Get everything you need, then meet up at the gate, I said, and the others nodded before we all headed out. 10 minutes later, Ino, Choji, Hinata, and I, as well as Kiba and Akamaru, gathered at the gate. I hope you don't mind Akamaru and I coming along. We figured you'd need help tracking Naruto, Kiba said, and I nodded before taking a look at everyone gathered. Okay, here's what we know. He was last seen close to the border between here and the Land of Wind. We can assume he was heading for somewhere he felt he could stay at, and the only place I know of there is the hidden sand, I said, getting a collective nod. All right, if you're ready, let's hold it, someone said, and I looked up only to notice Kakashi sitting on top of the guard post, his makeout tactics book in hand. Kakashi-sensei, Hinata said, and he jumped down, looking at each of us for a few seconds before sighing and closing his book. You all aren't planning on bringing Naruto back, are you? He asked, and I sighed, shaking my head. No, we know full well that that wouldn't be a good idea. No, we're going to find him and properly say goodbye, I said, and he looked at us in surprise. Oh. With the way you all went after Sasuke, I would have thought that you would do the same. However, I'm glad you aren't. You'd just be setting yourselves up for disappointment. Anyways, it looks like Naruto will be able to pass on his message himself, he said, and Hinata looked at him in confusion. Message? She asked, and Kakashi nodded. He wanted me to tell you all that he was sorry for leaving without saying goodbye or letting you know what happened. He said, well, thanks for telling us. Does this mean you aren't going to try and stop us? I asked, and he shook his head. Why would I? You're just going to say goodbye to a friend. One who is still a member of Team Kakashi in my eyes. It's not like you're leaving the village for good, he said, and I nodded. Thanks, Kakashi-sensei, I said, and he smiled, forming a few hand signs before disappearing using the body flicker technique. Feeling determined once again, I turned towards the others. Okay, let's go, I said, and the others fell in behind me as we exited through the gate. Wherever you are, Naruto, we are on our way. Naruto's POV. Sneezing, I wiped my nose on my sleeve, sniffling slightly, and Kurama frowned. You're not getting sick, are you? She asked, looking concerned, but I just shook my head. No, just a random sneeze. No reason for you to abandon your pride and start worrying, I said teasingly, and she smirked, rolling her eyes. Hey, Kurama, do you think you could put up your human disguise? I asked, and she flicked an ear. I guess I could, but why? Is something wrong? She asked, and I once again shook my head, coming to a halt. No, nothing's wrong. It's just look up ahead. You see that dune? I asked, and she nodded. Ever since the threat of the Akatsuki, the hidden sand set up a constant watch. As soon as we get past that sand dune, we'll be in their sights, and I'd rather not send anyone into a panic when we plan to for a place to stay, I said, and she nodded, changing herself to look human. When she was ready, we began to walk once more. Apparently, I was correct before, as when we passed by the dune and the stone outcrop hiding the village came into sight, a few seconds later, I noticed someone running towards us from the large stone wall. Pausing, I raised my arm to bar Kurama from taking another step. Waiting for the figure to get closer, I soon recognized the man in black as Kankuro. Naruto, he called as he got closer. It is you. I thought I recognized your orange and black jumpsuit through my scope. So, what can I do for you? He asked, and I sighed. We need to talk to Gaara, I said, gesturing to Kurama, who was standing close to my side. Looking between us, he grinned, raising an eyebrow. And who is this? Your girlfriend? He asked, and I paused before nodding, causing her eyes to light up. Quote, ... Yes, I said, and he grinned even more. Well, look at you. And here I thought you had your heart set on Sakura. He chuckled, and I frowned. Yeah, well, things change, I said, and he frowned, as if sensing I wasn't up for catching up. Shifting his weight to his other foot, he took a look back towards the direction of the village. So, may I ask what you want to talk to Gaara about? He asked, gesturing for us to follow him. Sighing, I shook my head. I don't really feel comfortable discussing it out here, but I promise I will explain everything when we get to Gaara's office. I said, and he nodded. So, how's the leaf? I noticed it's only you and Kurama, I said, and he nodded. Right, I noticed it was just you and Kurama. Is everything okay at village? He asked, and I scoffed silently, causing him to look at me in surprise. Whoa, was that a bit of contempt I heard? He asked, and I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Like I said, I'll explain everything. I said, and he nodded. Walking in silence, we eventually reached the stone wall that stood as the guard station. Stopping in front of it, Kankuro looked up at the top. Maki, he called, and a few seconds later, a woman looked down. I need to escort these two to Gaara, so you're in charge until I get back, okay? He asked, and she nodded before looking at us. Oh. Hello Naruto, she said, smiling and waving. Awkwardly, I waved back before we began to continue through the ravine-like entrance. Maki, why does that name sound familiar? I asked, and Kankuro raised an eyebrow. Probably because she was the leader of the squad you were placed in when you, Sakura, and Shikamaru came to help watch out for the Akatsuki. She's also my girlfriend, he said, and I looked surprised. Ha, congratulations. So, how long have you two been together? I asked, and he looked up at the sky fondly, a smile on his face. Tomorrow will make it a year, he said as we made it into the village. A few people smiled and waved, and I waved back. You know, I still find it weird when people actually go out of their way to be kind to me. I said, and Kankuro looked at me in confusion. You still getting trouble for being the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki? He asked, and I sighed, a slight frown on my face. You have no idea. That's mainly why I need to talk to Gaara, I said, and he looked at me in curiosity for a few seconds, but he didn't ask any questions. Actually, I have somewhat of an idea. Gaara still gets fearful looks from the elders of the village, even though he's been running himself into more and more stress trying to prove that they have nothing to fear. He said, and I looked at him in shock. Really, I would have thought he more than proved himself, I said, and he sighed. Unfortunately, some people still don't think so, and the fact that he is Kazekage doesn't seem to have helped. He said, and I went silent. How much Gaara had been going through finally sinking in. It isn't all bad though, Kankuro said, and I looked at him in confusion. He seems to take all the doubt he gets and use it as motivation. It just makes him work harder at his goals, he said, and I smiled. That seemed like Gaara all right. Continuing to walk through the village in silence, we eventually made it to the Kazekage's office. Well, here we are, he said, before leading us inside and down a hallway. Knocking on a door, he paused. Gaara, sorry to bother you, but you have visitors, he said, before opening the door when Gaara called us in. Walking inside, I could immediately see how stressed he was, resting his face in his hands for a few seconds. And rubbing his eyes before sighing. Yes, how can I help? He began, before his eyes widened when he saw me. Naruto, what are you doing here? He asked, before gesturing towards two chairs. Go on, have a seat. How long has it been since you were last here? He asked, and I sighed, sitting down on a wooden chair, Kurama taking the other. 2 years, almost 3. I said, before looking him in the eyes. Look, Gaara, I need to talk to you about something. I said, and he nodded, becoming serious. Kankuro, you can leave. He said, and Kankuro looked like he was about to argue, and I spoke up. No, it's okay. I did promise to answer his questions he asked me. I said, and Gaara sighed. I see. Then can you at least close the door? He asked, looking at Kankuro, and he nodded, quickly shutting the door before leaning against the wall. So, what did you want to talk about? He asked, and I frowned. First of all, I should tell you that I'm no longer a shinobi of the leaf. I have been exiled, I said, and Gaara sat up straight. His eyes widened as he looked at me in shock. What? When did this happen? He asked, and I sighed. It happened yesterday, I said, and he frowned, steepling his hands before looking thoughtful for a few seconds. Why were you exiled? No matter how hard I try, I can't picture you doing anything that would warrant it. He said, and I sighed, looking at Kurama and nodding. Understanding what I meant, she slowly stood up, catching the attention of Gaara and Kankuro. Okay, before I do anything, no, I am not here to cause trouble. However, if any of you make a move, I will have no trouble killing you, she said, and without waiting for their reaction, she released her disguise jutsu. Gaara looked at her in shock, while Kankuro reached for his kunai pouch. Seeing this, I stepped in between him and Kurama. But, why you're the, Gaara began, and Kurama rolled her eyes, placing a hand on her hip. The 9 tails. Yes, that's right, she said, and he turned his shocked eyes on me. How did she escape? It was to my understand that when a tailed beast is removed, the Jinchuriki dies, he said, and I cleared my throat awkwardly. All right, well, you see, I began, before turning towards Kurama. Well, she can explain it, I said, and she rolled her eyes at my childish embarrassment. I swear, Naruto, you can be so childish. Anyways, ... she said, turning to look at the case cage. I used something you've most likely never heard of. I used my chakra to place something called a mate mark on Naruto. She said, walking towards me and grabbing me before lifting the back of my shirt and showing the mark. Squirming out of her grip, I jumped back and glared at her. She chuckled before going solemn. To answer your other question, my escaping caused quite a bit of trouble between Naruto and Jiraiya. Since the one who sealed me and Naruto before is long dead, and there was no way to reseal me, Jiraiya exiled him a day after his birthday. She said, and I looked away. Gaara nodded, him and Kankuro having calmed down now that they realized Kurama wasn't going to start going on a rampage. I see. So, why did you come here? Kankuro asked, and I turned to Gaara. I was hoping I might be able to stay here, at least for a day or two. I have money, so I can pay for a room. I just need somewhere I can stay so I can figure out what to do next, I said, and Gaara nodded thoughtfully. Seeing this, Kankuro frowned. Gaara, I get that Naruto's a good friend, and he's helped us a lot, but is it really a good idea to take in a rogue ninja, especially one from the Hidden Leaf? This could sever our alliance with them, he said, and Gaara shook his head. Nonsense, he said before looking at me. Of course you can stay here for a bit. I can't give you a free room at the hotel, but I can give you up to a week to stay. 2 days is certainly not enough time to figure that out, he said, and Kankuro looked to be about to argue before being silenced with a glare. However, the only condition is that she stays in disguise. I don't want the villagers going into a panic, he said, and Kurama grumbled before bringing up her disguise. Thank you, Gaara. If you need any help around the village, just let me know. I'd hate to feel like I was freeloading, I said, and he smiled. Will do, Naruto. Kankuro, please show Naruto where the hotel is, he said, and Kankuro sighed, giving a nod before leading us out. As we walked out of the building, I frowned, looking at Kankuro. Look, I'm not trying to cause any trouble, I said, and he nodded. I know, it's just you inspired Gaara to become Kazekage. You proved to him that even a Jinchuriki could have friends. He's just going to keep on trying to make it up to you. I just hate for this village to come under fire because of his good nature, he said, before falling silent again, and I looked down. Eventually, we reached a small 2-story building that reminded me of the apartment building I lived in before. Well, here you are. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back to guard duty, he said, leaving us in front of the building. Walking inside, I walked up to the front desk. Handing the man at the desk some money, he handed me a key, and Kurama and I headed back outside before climbing the steps to our new room for the time being. Once the door was unlocked, Kurama instantly made her way inside, throwing herself onto the bed. "Ah, it feels great to be in a bed again," she said, sighing and closing her eyes in relaxation. Rolling my eyes, I set my backpack down. "Yeah, well, don't get used to it yet. We have to go get you some new clothes," I said, and she blinked, sitting up and looking at me in confusion. "I already have clothes, though," she said, and I frowned. "Yeah, my clothes. Clothes that I would rather have back," I said, and her eyes narrowed before she wrapped her arms around herself as if she were hugging herself. "Mine," she said, and I looked at her in exasperation for a few seconds before sighing. "Why do you like my clothes so much? They're men's clothes, and anyways, aren't they tight around your chest?" "It certainly looks that way," I said, and she blinked before giving me a smirk. "Oh, so you've been looking at my breasts. I'll just have to remember that," she said, causing me to look away. "As for why I like these clothes, see, they have your scent," she said, looking away in embarrassment. Looking at her strangely for a few seconds, I sighed. "Fine, keep them, but we're still going to get you more clothes. You can't just have one pair of clothes, and you're not getting any of my other clothes," I said, and she pouted before giving a sigh. "Fine, come on then. The sooner we get to relax, the better," she said, before getting up and walking to the door. Making sure I had my money, I followed her outside and locked the door before heading into the village's shopping district, Kurama still not looking very happy. Walking out of our apartment we are renting for the week, I locked the door before Kurama and I headed out, heading for the shopping district. As we walked, Kurama turned towards me, looking thoughtful. Looking back at her questioningly, I cleared my throat, and she blinked, realizing I was looking at her. "Sorry, I was just thinking about something," she said, and I raised an eyebrow. "Well then, a penny for your thoughts?" I asked, and she once again looked at me looking deep in thought. "I still sense a bunch of my chakra in you. I expected there to be remnants of my chakra still left in you, but not this much," she said, and I frowned, focusing on the chakra inside of me. "You know, now that you mention it, I can feel what you mean. Is this a bad thing?" I asked, and she shook her head. "No, in fact, this might be interesting. Tell me, didn't you learn how to do the Rasengan from the old pervert?" she asked, and I nodded, looking at her in confusion. "Yeah, but why?" I asked, and she smiled. "It may make it easier to teach you a new move," she said, and my eyes lit up, and I looked at her in excited curiosity. "What kind of new move?" I was told that the Rasengan was a move only Jiraiya and my father could use, as well as me, I said, and she nodded. "This new move wouldn't be the Rasengan, but it's similar, which is why you knowing it will make things much easier. I can explain it more, but we'd have to find a training ground we could use," she said, and I nodded, excited at the prospect of learning a new technique. Walking past a shop, Kurama suddenly stopped, looking at a sign on the window. "Ooh. They have tofu," she said, and I looked at her. "You like tofu?" I asked, and she looked at me in disbelief. "Of course I like tofu, who doesn't?" she said, and I frowned slightly, shifting from foot to foot. "Me for starters. I've never been a fan of tofu. I'd much rather have a bowl of miso ramen with pork any day," I said, and she gave me a sideways look. "You know, it might be a good idea to pick up some tofu anyways if you plan to summon a fox," she said, and I looked at her skeptically. "Are you sure you're not just trying to get me to buy some so you can take it?" I asked, and she pouted slightly. "Wow, so little trust," she said, though she didn't try to deny it. "Seriously though, nothing wins over a fox more than tofu. It's not necessary, but it's a good way to build trust between who you summon," she said, and I nodded in understanding. "I get it. So, kind of like Gamatsu. He was a lot more willing to help when I gave him snacks," I said, and she in confirmation. "Exactly," she said, and I sighed, opening the door to the store. Sitting behind the front counter, an older woman looked up from the book she was reading before giving a warm smile. "Ah, welcome," Can I help you? She asked, and I smiled back. Ah, yes. Do you have any more tofu? I asked, and she nodded, turning around and grabbing what looked like a small white block wrapped in plastic. Sure do. It's fresh, too. I just received the soy from the land of sound, so I was able to make the tofu last night, she said, and I nodded, pulling out my wallet. So, how much does it cost? I asked, and she took out a paper to record the sale. That will be 2 REO, she said, and I looked up at her in confusion. Really, isn't that a little cheap? I asked, and she shrugged, giving a little sigh. Maybe, but tofu isn't that popular here, so I tend to sell it at a lower price. She said, and I frowned, looking at Kurama. You know what? Can I get 3? I asked, setting 6 REO on the counter, and she looked at me in surprise, before nodding and grabbing 2 more sealed blocks of tofu, setting them in a box with the other, marking the paper. Thank you, I said, and she shook her head. No, thank you, she said, placing the 6 REO behind the counter and handing me the box. Giving her one last wave, we walked out, box in tow. After the door closed, Kurama looked at me in confusion. I thought you didn't like tofu, so why did you pick up 3 things of it? She asked, and I sighed. I don't. I just felt bad. Okay. She was forced to sell it for that cheap, and I guess I just wanted to help out. I said, looking away. Kurama continued to look at me for a few seconds before sighing. Wow, that was kind, she said, and I rolled my eyes looking at her expectantly. What, are you going to mock me for being kind? After all, you used to do that a lot back when you were still locked inside of me. I said, and she frowned, shaking her head. No, just be careful, okay? You don't want to be too generous with your money. If you are, you can quickly build a reputation of being an easy mark. Also, remember your money needs to last, she said, and I looked at her in surprise, honestly expecting her to mock me like she used to. Walking in silence for a few minutes, she turned to look at me, or more accurately, the box in my hand. So, since you don't like tofu, she started, and I sighed, opening the box and tossing her one of the sealed blocks of tofu. Giving a small cheer, she caught it and tore open the plastic, immediately beginning to nibble at the food. Not understanding how she could like that stuff, I slowly shook my head, though I stayed silent as we walked, still looking for a place that sold clothes. Naruto, someone called, and both Kurama and I turned around, only to recognize the blonde-haired girl who occasionally helped train the genin in the hidden leaf. Stopping, I waited for her to catch up, and Kurama stepped closer to me possessively as usual. Hey Temari, I said, and she smiled and nodded before her face turned serious. Hey, Kankuro told me what happened, she said, before looking at Kurama, who was still nibbling at the tofu while remaining glued to my side. Is it true that you're the 9 tails? She asked, and Kurama's eyes narrowed slightly as Temari took a step closer to get a good look. Yes, I am, Kurama said, and Temari stopped looking between the both of us before a look of realization crossed her face, and she let out a chuckle, her gaze falling on Kurama. Oh, relax, you have nothing to worry about from me, she said before turning to me. So, how was Shikamaru the last time you saw him? She asked, and Kurama seemed to relax slightly. Sighing, I gave a shrug. I haven't seen him since before my birthday, but I guess he's been doing okay. I mean, he's been a lot busier since he's taken on more responsibilities in the leaf, I said, and she nodded before looking at me in surprise. Wait, birthday, how old are you now? She asked, and I sighed. As of yesterday, I turned 19. Though, do you mind if we change the subject? I asked, not feeling like thinking about it. Temari nodded before clearing her throat. So, what are you both doing? She asked. Well, we were actually looking for somewhere that sells clothes as Kurama needs some. Also, is there a training area we could use where I could practice some new techniques that Kurama wants to teach me? I asked, and she thought for a few seconds before nodding. I know the perfect spot to train. It's outside the village, and I'm pretty sure only Gaara, Kankuro, and I know about it, so you shouldn't have to worry about interruptions. I'll have to show it to you, she said, and I gave her a thankful smile. As for the clothes shop, I can take you there, and perhaps help you pick out the right clothes, she said under her breath, her gaze falling on Kurama, whose eyes narrowed. I heard that. Are you saying there's something wrong with these clothes? Maybe you should keep your opinions to yourself before I make you, she said, clenching her fist, and I winced, giving Temari an apologetic look, but to my surprise, she held her hands up in mock surrender. No need. Nothing is wrong with the style per se. It's just those clothes are distinctly male. Don't you think you'd be more comfortable in different clothes? I mean, if it's the design you like, you could always ask for them to stitch it onto some new clothes. She said, and Kurama grumbled, gripping the fabric of my old shirt. Seeing this, Temari sighed. I'll still take you both to the shop. At least look at some of the clothes, okay? She asked, and Kurama just mumbled, starting to walk in front of us. Temari began to lead us farther into the village. After a few minutes, she turned to look at me curiously. So, you and Kurama are together. I never would have pegged you as that type of person, but I guess that just goes to show that you never really know someone. She said, and I rolled my eyes. I didn't really have a choice. She wouldn't let me go until she had her way with me. I said, and Kurama flinched before looking at me accusingly. Well, you certainly have a strange way of showing discomfort. She said, and I glared at her. That's because I accepted the fact that I was trapped until you were done. I said, and she pointedly looked away. Sighing, I looked back at Temari, who was silently listening. Though, besides the circumstances of how it happened, I guess I am happy. I said, and she looked at me in interest. At least Kurama doesn't send me flying whenever I get too close. Plus, she knows everything about me. I said, and Temari nodded. Well, besides the start, it seems like a decent relationship. She said, and I nodded half-heartedly, while Kurama stayed silent. After a few minutes, we arrived at a small building, and Temari opened the door, holding it open for us. Well, this is it, she said, and we walked inside. Looking around, I saw that there was a lot of clothes hanging around. Why don't you look around for anything you like? She asked, and Kurama looked around before immediately walking towards a rack of clothes to our left, reaching out and grabbing a plain black t-shirt. Looking at it for a few seconds, she picked up a couple more, as well as picking out a few pairs of matching sweatpants before walking back towards us. Okay, I got everything I need, she said, and Temari looked at the clothes in her hands in confusion. Are you sure that's what you want? Don't you want a bit of variety? She asked, and Kurama looked at her levelly for a few seconds. I'm sure, she said, before looking thoughtful for a few seconds. Though I may get them customized, she said, and Temari nodded. Okay then, why don't you go into the changing rooms and try one on to see if it fits? She said, and Kurama nodded, taking the new shirts with her before heading into one of the back rooms. Turning to look at Temari, I sighed, taking out my wallet and looking at the amount of money I had left, estimating I only had about 200 Rio left. So, how much do you think all those clothes are going to cost? I asked, and she frowned. It depends on the customizations she gets. Without customizations, probably around 100 Rio, but with them, it could come out to about 300. She said, and I coughed, my eyes widening. Seeing my reaction, she gave me a sympathetic look. Clothes are generally expensive, but don't worry, I'll take care of it, she said, and I looked at her in surprise. What? Why? I mean, I'm thankful, but that's a lot of money, I said, and she nodded. Exactly. The fact that Kurama is wearing what I'm guessing are your clothes, I'm assuming that is the only thing she has right now. Also, something tells me you need all the money you can get, so you save your money, I'll take care of the clothes, she said, and I thanked her. She nodded, giving me a smile before we stood in silence. A few minutes later, she broke the silence. So, tell me, how do you really feel about Kurama? I mean, I know you said you were happy, but you didn't really seem to act that way, she said, taking a look to make sure Kurama was still in the changing room. I sighed. I really meant what I said, but what am I supposed to think? All my life, she's given me trouble, pestering me to release the seal. Now, all of the sudden, she likes me and has marked me as her mate, which I'm pretty sure she did just to escape. She did offer to remove the mark, but I don't know, I said, and Temari just nodded, listening as I got my thoughts out. When I finished, she sighed. You want my opinion? She asked, and I nodded. Give her a chance. I believe that she really does like you. I mean, why else would she get defensive whenever other women get close to you? If you really are wary of her, why don't you just try and talk it out with her? She said, and I nodded. However, before I could say anything, the dressing room door opened, and Kurama walked out, holding her pile of clothes. Oh. Hey Kurama, did everything fit all right? I asked, and she looked at me for a few seconds before nodding. So, what kind of design were you planning on getting on the shirts? Temari asked, and Kurama looked at the shirts. I was kind of thinking of getting a fox on the front. For obvious reasons, she said, and Temari nodded before reaching her hands out for the clothes. Yeah, I can get that for you. If you hand me the clothes, I'll pay for them. She said. Kurama handed them to her, and Temari took them over to the front counter, leaving us alone. Looking over at Kurama, I became aware that she was purposefully avoiding my eyes. Raising an eyebrow, I considered asking her if something was on her mind, but before I could, Temari made her way back to us. Okay, here are your sweatpants. Your shirts won't be ready today, so you'll have to wait a bit and pick them up later. She said, and Kurama nodded. Right, now for that training area you were talking about earlier. I said, and she blinked before a look of realization crossed her face, and she nodded. Right, come on then, and I'll show you where it is. She said, and we followed her out the door. As we walked towards the gate, she turned towards us. Hey, do you think I can watch you both training? I'm interested to see what kinds of jutsu you'll be learning. She said, and I shrugged. Sure, I don't see anything wrong with that. What about you? I asked, turning to look at Kurama, and she frowned. That's not really a good idea. The jutsu I plan to teach Naruto is volatile. He'll need all the concentration he can get, she said, and Temari looked at her with wide eyes. Are you sure that's a good jutsu to teach him? She asked, and I rolled my eyes. Oh. Come on, there's nothing to worry about. I said, and Kurama nodded in agreement. He isn't wrong. He already knows the Rasengan. He shouldn't have a problem learning how to use this, she said, and Temari still didn't look convinced. Well, just be careful. Don't blow yourself up, she said, and I nodded before we all fell into silence once again. Eventually, after walking for nearly 10 minutes after leaving the village, we came across a cave. Here it is. Farther into the cave, it widens out. It makes a pretty great training area, and Kankuro put up some training dummies in there, she said, before going quiet for a few seconds. Anyways, I should probably leave you two to your training now. Like I said, only Gaara, Kankuro, and I know about this place, so you shouldn't get any interruptions. She said, before turning and heading back in the direction of the village, leaving us alone. Sighing, Kurama stuck a finger out and focused her chakra into her finger, causing a small, albeit brief, orange flame to appear on her fingertip, before she turned towards the cave. Right, come on, she said curtly, and I looked at her in confusion for a few seconds, before quickly catching up to her before she could get too far ahead. Hey, wait, is everything okay? Yesterday and this morning, you almost seemed like you were mellowing out. Now you seem like something is bothering you, I said, and she gritted her teeth slightly, the flame on her finger flickering slightly, before she took a breath and calmed herself. Just don't worry about it, she said, and I looked at her, now sure that something was bothering her. No, if something is on your mind, please tell me. Why are you acting like maybe I just realized that you don't respond to kindness? She snapped, and the flame popped, going out, leaving us in complete darkness. Groaning, she refocused her chakra and brought the flame back. Looking at her in shock, I shook my head. What are you talking about? I asked, and she rolled her eyes. What am I supposed to think? All my life, she's given me trouble, pestering me to release the seal. Now all of a sudden, she likes me. She mocked, and I flinched. Yeah, that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? She said, and I sighed. You heard that? I asked, and she turned to glare at me, and I found myself backing up slightly. Of course I, heard that. Did you forget who I am? My ears are way more sensitive than a human's, she said before sighing. Be honest, do you even actually want the mate mark? She asked. Because like I said, I could always remove it. At least you won't have to worry about whether or not to trust me, she said, and I frowned. If your hearing is as sensitive as you say, then you must have heard me say that I meant what I said about being happy. It's just I don't do well with instances where people just change that suddenly. You attempted to take over my body before, so excuse me for being wary of you at first, I said, and she sighed, placing a hand on my shoulder. Naruto, think about this for a second. If I wasn't as fond of you as I am, would I have let you know about the summoning contract I swore to keep safe and secret? If I planned to double-cross you, why would I be teaching you a move that if you used correctly, could kill me? She asked, and I looked at her in surprise. And finally, if I wanted to harm you in any way, I had my chance in that cave we spent the night in before getting here. If I had any evil intent, I wouldn't have missed that chance like that. Do you still think I'm untrustworthy? She asked, and I frowned. Not really, I said, and she gave me a small smile. Good, you were starting to become like the villagers back at the Leaf. You weren't even giving me a chance, she said, and my eyes widened before I looked away. I apologize for that. To answer your previous question though, I do want to keep the mark, but you have as much of a choice as I do on whether you remove it or not, I said, and she looked at me seriously. You do understand that by keeping the mark, you are agreeing to be my mate. You understand how significant this choice is, right? She asked, and I nodded. After a few seconds, she gave me a sideways grin. Hey, I don't know. How do I know you're serious about this? I'm afraid you're going to have to prove how serious you are, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. And how do I go about doing that? I asked, and she licked her lips. When we get back to our room, before we consummate things, you are going to pleasure me and bring me to orgasm, she said, and I raised an eyebrow. Really? That's all? Easy, I said, and she grinned, showing that there was more to it. With your tongue, she said, sticking hers out at me and wiggling it suggestively. At a loss for words, I opened my mouth a few times, but nothing came out. Chuckling, she raised an eyebrow. Still think it's going to be easy? She asked, and when I didn't answer, she just smiled. Either way, those are the rules, she said, before beginning to walk ahead of me. Quickly getting a hold of myself, I walked faster to catch up with her. What had I just gotten myself into? Making our way farther into the cave, we continued on down the dark corridor. The only thing keeping us from getting turned around was the bright flame currently burning strong on top of Kurama's index finger. Watching the flame, I couldn't help wondering how she was doing that. What jutsu is that? I asked, and she looked at me in curiosity before following my gaze. What? This? She asked, gesturing to the flame, and I nodded. Sighing, she frowned at me. It's not a jutsu, it's pure fire energy, she said, and I looked at her in confusion. Seeing this, she sighed again. Basically, I'm just taking my fire style and focusing it on my finger. As long as I keep my focus on the flame, it won't go out, she said, and I nodded in understanding. That's pretty cool, I said, and she shook her head, much to my confusion. Not really. I mean, anyone could do this if they focus enough, she said, and I frowned. Do you think I could do something like that with wind energy? I asked, and she looked thoughtful for a few seconds. Well, you obviously can't create a flame, but you could possibly use it to make wind senbon. Also, you could use it to add more power to your shuriken and kunai, she said. I looked at my hand in wonder, and Kurama smiled. Maybe after we work on this new technique, I'll teach you what I know. I do know wind style as well, after all, she said, and I nodded. So, what is this new technique you want to teach me, anyways? You've just been calling it a new technique, yet you haven't even told me what it is, I said, and she grinned. The Bayou Bomb, she said, and I looked at her in confusion for a few seconds. Bayou Bomb, I repeated, and she nodded. Exactly. The highest level move a Jinchuriki can use, she said, and I blinked before frowning, causing her to look at me in confusion. I'm not really a Jinchuriki anymore, though. Wouldn't that mean I couldn't use this Bayou Bomb technique? I asked, and she shook her head. Not necessarily, she said, and I looked at her in interest. Do you remember what I said this morning about a lot of my chakra still remaining in you? She asked, and I nodded. Well, theoretically, you could still be able to do it using that chakra. She said, and I nodded, beginning to look excited again. Smiling, she shook her head slightly. However, we'll have to wait until we get to this training ground to find out for sure. She said, before we fell silent, focusing on the path ahead. Eventually, after walking for a few more minutes, we made it to a wide open area. Looking around, Kurama whistled slightly. Well, this certainly does look like a training grounds, she said. It is a bit dark, though. If this has been used by those three from the hidden sand, it should have. She began before noticing some torches on the wall. Walking over to them, she lit them using her finger. There, she said before making her way back. Oh, this will do great, she said, her eyes trailing around the cave and the dummies that lined the walls. Now that we're here, does that mean you'll finally teach me the Bayou bomb? I asked, and she looked at me, rolling her eyes. You really are an impatient brat, aren't you? She said before sighing. Though, I guess I have been keeping you waiting for long enough. She said, looking at me with crossed arms. Okay, first, let's see your Rasengan, she said, and I nodded, creating a shadow clone. Blinking, she frowned, looking at me in confusion. What are you doing? She asked, and I paused. I'm creating a Rasengan, I said, and she shook her head. No, you're not. Last time I checked, the Rasengan was a one-handed move that didn't require shadow clones, she said, and I looked away. I can't infuse enough chakra without a shadow clone, I said, and she looked at me for a long moment before sighing and rubbing the bridge of her nose. Fine, that's okay. At least tell me you have enough control over it to throw the Rasengan, she said, and when I didn't say anything, she shook her head. If you can't control your chakra enough to use the Rasengan, I'm not even going to bother teaching you the Bayou bomb, she said, and I looked at her in shock. Oh, come on, I'm still able to use Rasengan, so what's the problem? I asked, and she looked at me incredulously. Barely. You were barely able to use it. If you can't fully utilize your chakra, how are you going to control mine? If you try the Bayou bomb, you'd end up blowing yourself up. No, until you can form the Rasengan one-handed, I won't even attempt to teach you the Bayou bomb, she said, and I sighed. What are we going to do now then? I said, and she frowned, looking thoughtful for a few seconds before she seemed to have an idea. You still have that tofu on you, right? She asked, and I nodded, rolling my eyes. Yeah. Why, are you still hungry? I asked, and she gave me a long look. Yes, but that isn't why I was asking, she said, and I passed her a block of tofu without another word. She immediately ripped open the plastic before taking a bite, humming happily. After a few seconds, she sighed in content. Anyways, now would be a good time to try summoning a fox. That was why I wanted to know if you had any tofu left, she said, and I nodded. I suppose now would be a good time. Do I just use the same hand signs? I asked, and she nodded. Yes, Naruto. The hand signs are universal. They don't change. The kind of summon that shows up just depends on the contract you signed, she said, and I shrugged, creating the hand signs before biting my finger and pressing my hand against T. He ground. A second later, a puff of smoke appeared, and from within, I could just barely see the outline of a small fox. Oi! Where am I? It asked, and Kurama groaned. Looking at her in confusion, I was about to ask her what was wrong when the fox turned to look at us. And who the hell are you? It demanded, and I turned to look at him. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, the one who summoned you, I said, and he scoffed, looking at me in disbelief. You summon me? I don't think so, kid. A brat like you couldn't summon me. I was the Sage of Six Paths, Sun's first summon, he said, and Kurama took a step forward, her eye twitching. Grabbing him by the tail and lifting him up, he yipped. Hey, watch the tail, he said, and Kurama glared at him. This brat, as you call him, is my mate, so I suggest you treat him with respect, she said, and he met her eyes. Why the hell should I care who he began before looking closely at her eyes? Kurama, he asked in disbelief, and she released his tail, causing him to land on his side awkwardly before getting up and shaking the dust from his fur. That's right. And as for why you should show Naruto respect, I wonder what Hiromi would think if she found out that you were giving the fox Sumo NS a bad name by not listening to your summoner. Oh. And don't go acting all high and mighty. If I remember correctly, the only reason you were summoned by Old Man Six Paths' son was because he used the least amount of chakra in order to see who would be summoned. She said, and he looked away. Looking at Kurama once again, I looked at her in curiosity. You two know each other? I asked, and she sighed, rolling her eyes. Unfortunately, this is Tatsu, one of the weakest fox summons. Though I will admit, what he lacks in strength, he more than makes up with stealth. However, I highly suggest you unsummon him and try again for a stronger summon. She said, and I disregarded her suggestion for a second as I looked the small fox over. Tatsu, huh? I asked, and he looked at me questioningly. So, you're my new summoner, huh? He asked, and I nodded before remembering the tofu. Opening the box, I set the tofu on the ground, and he sniffed it. Tofu, huh, maybe you're not that bad, kid, he said before taking a bite. Not as good as back home, but still pretty good. So, what exactly do you want me to do? Steal, help you get into a locked building? He asked, and I looked at him in shock. What? No, I just expect you to help with tracking and reconnaissance, I said, and he looked at me blankly for a minute before sighing. Kid, do I look like one of those ninja hounds to you? If you wanted that, you should have signed their contract, he said, and I went to open my mouth, but before I could say anything, Kurama stepped forward, causing Tatsu to step back. Look, it's not like he's asking you to do something you've never done before. And he can't exactly sign any other contract. He's not part of a village, she said, and he rolled his eyes. Fine, not like I have much choice, he said, before looking at me. Is there any tracking or recon you need done? He asked, and when I shook my head, he sighed. Well, if you'll excuse me, I'll be going now, he said, before vanishing in a puff of smoke. For a few seconds, we both just stared at where the small fox had been, before I turned to Kurama. Stealing, breaking in, what did he mean? Is that what a fox summon does? I asked, and she hesitated for a second or two before sighing. I may have left that part out when explaining the fox summons, she said, and I looked at her questioningly. You see, sure, fox summons are great at tracking and reconnaissance, but that's not the only thing they're good at. Because of their sneakiness, they make great thieves, able to help steal documents and retrieve stolen property. There is nothing saying you can't summon a fox for just their tracking and recon skills, but some of them, Tatsu included, feel that that is below the true potential, which is why I suggested you try and summon a different fox. So, next time I make a suggestion, don't just ignore it, she said before sighing. That being said, you don't have to summon foxes if that bothers you. Your name will still be on the contract, but you don't have to summon, she said, and I thought for a few seconds before shrugging. No, I'm not going to just decide not to summon because of something like this. I mean, who knows? Those skills may come in handy one day. I just don't want to do something that could get me in the bingo book. I'm already a rogue ninja, and that has no doubt landed me in it, but I don't want to give them any more reasons, I said, and she nodded in understanding before sighing again. So, you up for learning how to incorporate wind energy into your attacks now? I did say I'd teach you that, she said, and I nodded excitedly, causing her to chuckle. Right, so you know how to use wind style correctly, yes? She asked, and I nodded again. Well, I know how to combine it with my Rasengan, so I'd say yes, I said, and a look of remembrance crossed her face. Right, you're a Scent Shuriken. Too bad you can't use that without risking your ability to use chakra, she said before holding out her hand. Anyways, that should make teaching you easier. Here, hand me a shuriken, she said, and I did what I was told, handing her the mentioned weapon. Focusing on the shuriken, she began using wind style, causing the throwing star to glow a bluish-white in color. First, you need to focus on the shuriken. Then, begin to channel wind energy into it until it is glowing steadily, she said before turning her gaze and aiming at one of the practice dummies. Once you've successfully channeled your wind energy into your shuriken, take aim at your target and let it fly, she said, and with a steady breath and a flick of her wrist, she sent the shuriken flying towards the dummy so fast that the only sign it was thrown was the loud thunk of the metal shuriken embedding itself in the wooden dummy. Just like that, she said, and I looked at her in shock. She only grinned before looking at me. Now you try, she said, and I slowly made my way to the wooden dummy to retrieve my shuriken, only to find that it was buried too far to pull out. Taking out another shuriken, I made my way over to Kurama. When I was standing next to her, she took a step back, gesturing for me to go ahead. Beginning to focus my wind energy into the shuriken in my hand, the throwing star flickered, but no matter how hard I tried, it would not glow. After a few seconds, I looked at her for help. It's not working, I said, and she sighed. I can see that. You're focusing too much on the shuriken and not enough on the actual wind energy. Therefore, you aren't able to build enough of it. Sure, you need to focus on the shuriken, but try to balance your focus on both things at once, she said, and I frowned before trying it again. After a few tries, I finally succeeded in transferring the wind energy into the shuriken, causing it to glow, and Kurama perked up slightly. There you go. Now aim for the dummy and throw the shuriken, she said, and I focused on my target for a few seconds before throwing the shuriken, sending it zipping through the air. The throwing star hit the dummy with a loud bang, and I let out a small cheer before running to collect it. As I made it to the shuriken, however, I couldn't help but frown slightly as I discovered that it didn't embed itself in the wood as far as it had for Kurama. Walking over as well, she smiled encouragingly at me before noticing my look of disappointment. Hey, what's wrong? That was pretty good, she said, and I just continued to frown. I don't know, that wasn't even close to the power you put behind it when you threw your shuriken, I said, and she looked at me in surprise before giving me an exasperated look. Are you serious? That was your first time infusing wind energy into a weapon. Of course, you're not going to be doing it like me right away. What were you expecting? She said, and I looked away. Like I said before though, for your first time trying this, you did pretty good, she said, and I gave her a small smile. But, not good enough to move on to the wind senbon? I asked, and she rolled her eyes. One thing at a time, she said before looking seriously at me. Remember, I still want you to work on using the Rasengan without the need of shadow clones. You don't want to overwhelm yourself, she said, and I nodded in understanding. Well, then I guess I should get back to training, I said, and she frowned looking around. I don't know, we've been here for long enough for today. We should be getting back. You may not be feeling it now, but wine style tends to tire you out. So, forcing yourself to use Rasengan right now would be a bad idea, she said, and I frowned. Come on, I feel fine. Can't we stay a bit longer? I asked, and she sighed. Think hard about this. If you pass out here, you'll be staying the night here as I'm not carrying you back. I warned you, so it'd be your own fault, she said, and I sighed. Fine, I said, and she frowned looking at me for a few seconds. Don't worry, Naruto, there's still plenty of time to train. Taking a break now will just give you a full day of training tomorrow, she said, and I sighed. You have a point. I just really want to get stronger, I said, and she nodded, walking forward and placing a hand on my shoulder. I know you do, but you can't if you're passed out from exhaustion. Now come on, let's get going, she said, and I nodded as she sent a quick burst of wind energy to put out the torches before creating a flame over her finger once again. I couldn't help but look at her, feeling impressed. Think you can teach me how to do that with wind energy? I asked, and she rolled her eyes. All in good time, Naruto, all in good time, she said before leading the way out of the cave. Shikamaru's paw following closely after Kiba and Akamaru. The others and I traveled in silence as we followed Naruto's scent. As we walked, Kiba looked troubled. What's up, Kiba? Is something wrong? I asked, and he paused, Akamaru stopping next to him. No, nothing's wrong. I'm just thinking about what you said about Naruto traveling with the 9 tails. At first, I didn't really believe it, but there's definitely a second scent mixed in with his, he said, and Akamaru gave a whine. Quote, What if Naruto doesn't even want to see us? Hinata asked, and I looked at her in shock. Do you honestly think he would feel that way, Hinata? This is Naruto we're talking about, I said, and she fell silent for a few seconds before sighing. I know, and I hate to even think this way, but it seems as if Naruto may have changed. The Naruto I know would never have released the 9 tails willingly, she said, and Kiba nodded. Yeah, after all these years, it's hard to believe he would do something like this, he said, and I shook my head. Guys, why he did it isn't important anymore. We're here to say goodbye to him and to wish him luck, I said, and Ino nodded. Shikamaru's right. We could try all we want to figure out why he released the 9 tails, but all that really matters now is that Naruto is no longer in the village, and this may be our last time seeing him, she said before sighing. The village is definitely going to be different with him gone. I can't imagine how the news is going to affect Sakura when she finds out, she said, and I frowned. Something tells me she already knows, I said, and she looked at me thoughtfully. That would explain why she hasn't really left her home lately, but why wouldn't she tell us that Naruto had been exiled? She asked, and I shrugged. Not really sure. Kiba, is their scent still going in the same direction? I asked, and he nodded. Yeah, they still seem to be heading west, he said. They seem to be heading towards the hidden sand village, which makes sense with Gaara being Kazekage and all, I said before going silent. I hope Gaara is able to give Naruto a place to stay. They may be good friends, but I can imagine Lady Tsunade causing trouble, Choji said, and I shook my head. He'll be fine. Lady Tsunade can't do much now that she labeled him a rogue ninja, and he is possibly out of the land of fire, I said, and the others seemed happy with this answer. However, I couldn't help but frown as I left out the fact that it wasn't Lady Tsunade that Naruto would have to look out for, but the Land of Wind's feudal lord. Following Kiba and Akamaru, I silently hoped with all I had that I was right, and Naruto would be okay. Naruto's POV. Unlocking the front door, I opened it, and Kurama immediately flopped onto the bed, releasing her disguise almost before I could close the door. Letting out a sigh, she closed her eyes. Man, I love beds, she said, and I nodded awkwardly, remaining silent for a few seconds before clearing my throat. So, how is this going to work? I asked, referring to what she wanted me to do when we got back. She cracked open an eye, looking at me in confusion for seconds before understanding what I was talking about. Frowning, she sat up looking me directly in the eyes as I sat down on the bed. Oh, Naruto, you do realize that I was just messing with you before, right? She asked, and I looked at her in confusion. Seeing this, she sighed. You have nothing to prove. I know you were being serious about keeping the mark and becoming my mate. I guess you could say I have a sixth sense. I've been around for so long that I can tell when people are lying or have ill intentions, she said before going on, so don't worry, okay? She asked, and I blinked before sighing. Are you sure? That wouldn't really be fair to you, though, I said, and she looked confused. After all, you did something like that for me before. What kind of mate would I be if I didn't return the favor? I asked, and she looked at me for a few silent moments before giving me a smile. I'm sure, she said, going quiet for a few seconds before grinning at me. Though I am in the mood for something else, if you're up for it, she said, giving me a look that made me slightly nervous. Oh, sure, I said, and she continued to grin, beginning to take off her clothes. Nervously, I began to remove mine. After getting her panties off, she looked at me, rolling her eyes when she saw that I still had my pants on. Pushing me over onto my back, she began pulling my pants and boxers down my legs. Hey, I said in surprise. Sorry, but you're being too slow, she said, and I sighed. I'm sorry, I'm just nervous. I'm still not used to this kind of thing, I said, and she paused for a second before giving me a calming smile. Hey, there's no need to be nervous. The first time we did it, it felt good, didn't it? She asked, and I nodded. Don't worry, I'll go slow if you want, but I promise you have nothing to be nervous about, she said, gently grabbing my member now that my boxes were down. Wrapping her fingers around it, she looked me in the eyes, slowly pumping her hand, causing me to groan slightly as I steadily began to harden. When I was hard enough, she grinned, straddling me and aligning my dick with her, closing her eyes and sighing in pleasure. She carefully lowered her hips, my dick sinking farther into her until I was fully inside her. Catching her breath, she slowly opened her eyes. "See there," she said, and I looked into her eyes as she panted slightly in pleasure. Taking a deep breath, I carefully wrapped my arms around her and pulled her against me, locking my lips against hers. Eyes widening slightly, she slowly closed her eyes once again, relaxing into the kiss as my hips began moving on their own. A few seconds later, she pulled away from the kiss, looking at me. Whatever happened to that nervousness you were just feeling? You seem to be getting quite into this," she said, before letting out a moan and wrapping her legs around me as I bumped her G-spot. "I can't help it. This feels good," I said, and with a grin, she began to grind against me. Oh yeah. Well, if you think this feels good, just wait. Just sit back and let me do the work," she said, starting to pick up speed, and I let out a groan. Not one to be outdone, I reached up and grabbed her boobs, remembering how sensitive they were. Rubbing her right nipple with my thumb and taking her left one in my mouth, she gasped, and she tightened around my dick. Hey, I thought I told you to just sit back," she said, and I smirked. "Yeah, but you don't seem to mind too much," I said, before giving her breasts a small squeeze, causing her to once again grip me tighter, and I could tell she was getting closer to her release. "Your breasts really are sensitive, aren't they?" I asked, and she looked away slightly before adding more force to her thrusts to bring me closer as well. "Ash, shut up," she said, and I just grinned, continuing to knead her boobs. Eventually, after a few minutes, I began to feel the telltale tightening that warned of my impending orgasm, and I tried to hold it back. As if sensing how close I was, she looked me in the eyes. "Hey, are you getting close?" she asked, and I hesitated for a second or two before nodding. "Why, yes, but I think I could hold it back for a bit longer," I said, and she shook her head. "Don't, I'm getting close as well." "Gee, go ahead," she said, keeping her legs tightly around my back as she grinded her hips against mine. Stopping my holding back, I began matching her thrusts as the feeling of release began getting stronger. Unable to pull away with her legs around me, I thrusted in as far as I could go before letting go, beginning to come. Feeling the sudden warmth, Kurama moaned, her tunnel rhythmically clenching around my dick, milking me of my __, and sending it deeper within her. Shuddering, she twitched as my orgasm sent her over the edge. Digging her face into the crook of my neck, she moaned. After a few seconds, we both began to wind down. Holy, that was great," I said, and she only nodded, catching her breath. After a few seconds of silence, I looked at her in confusion, only to notice that she was asleep, cuddled up against me, my dick still inside of her, though it was beginning to soften. Shaking my head, I leaned over to pull the blanket over us. Wrapping my arms around her and pulling her a bit closer, she smiled in her sleep, nuzzling against me and sighing. Closing my eyes, I yawned before joining her in sleep. So guys, what do you think about this Naruto story? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Naruto what if stories, make sure to subscribe to Universe of Naruto. Thanks for watching.